Wendy's has the best nuggets, okay? I'm sorry, you can Chick-fil Cope all you want, but I'm right. Oh, why am I talking about Wendy's? Well, tonight we have a very long and horrifying story of a Wendy's haunted by a very creepy car and its 2 occupants, plus some other stories featuring extremely unsettling rules you should never break, or else, and spirits with unknown and often creepy motives. These are tales from the break room. Give us a follow and review on Spotify and Apple Podcasts. That would be very handsome of you. Thank you. The Severed Head, from William P. 85. I want to tell you something that happened to me several years ago. Like 10 years ago, or more maybe. I was 17 at that time. It was my first serious job as a waiter in a restaurant in Mexico City, or a place close to it. And the truth is, I had no experience at all. Nevertheless, they gave me the opportunity because my uncle had worked there for many years before, and they still remembered him fondly, even though he no longer lived in the city at the time. I totally understood. My uncle is a cool guy. As it usually happens with your first job, when you're a teenager or young adult, the first few days were exciting. Learning how to carry trays, wait on tables, get along with customers, especially with difficult ones or Karens, and move quickly through the aisles without bumping into anything or anyone. However, there were also tough days. I usually left work very late at night, with the smell of food permeating my clothes and my feet and back aching from spending so many hours on my feet. That night started out like any other, very busy, with lots of customers, until all of them left and we finally managed to close the place for the night. The guy who normally gave me rides every night was resting, or I think it was his day off, so I had to go out alone. There was no one left outside at the time. The boulevard that led to my bus stop was almost empty, just the occasional car passing by, which felt a little creepy to me, to be honest. As soon as I started walking, I heard something strange. It was like a murmur, as if someone had asked for help. I stopped, looking around, but I couldn't see anyone. Not a soul. There was no wind either. I looked through the bushes that grew in the vacant lot next to the boulevard. They were a little tall, but I swore I'd heard a voice. Although it seemed like there was nothing there, I continued walking. But now my nerves were on edge, and my bladder was about to betray me. The silence of the street seemed more terrifying than usual, as if something or someone had extinguished all the noises coming from afar. I reached the pedestrian bridge and began to climb the stairs. It was there that I heard that strange noise again. It was a long, muffled moan, as if someone was in pain, and it came from under the bridge. I stopped halfway down the stairs and I looked down. What I'm gonna say is very terrifying. It's horrible, frightening, and you should be warned that this is not for the faint of heart. But do understand that I am sure that this is what I saw. Down in the street was a severed human head. Yes, a head. It did not have a body, just the head lying on the asphalt, as if someone had just left it there. And the most terrifying thing was that it seemed to move, as if it was trying to talk to me. I realized those moans had been coming from it. I did not know how to react. I felt my legs go numb, as if fear would not let me move. But that only lasted a few seconds, since I almost immediately ran away from that cursed place. I ran like never before in my life. I didn't even wait at the stop for my bus to arrive. I ran the 2 kilometers that I had to go to get home. I ran with my heart about to jump out of my chest. I made that classic horror movie mistake of looking back, and I saw the mouth of that head moving like it was still trying to talk to me. I arrived, soaked in sweat, trembling, and that night I could not sleep a wink. I had nightmares because of what I'd seen. Afterwards, every time I left the restaurant late, I preferred to call an Uber, even if it meant spending half of what I'd earned that day, just so I would not have to walk down that boulevard alone again. I quit my job soon after, but I will never forget what I saw that night. Years later, when my uncle came to visit the city, it came up that I had also worked at the same restaurant as him. Of course, he asked about some of his old friends, and he began to tell me some of his stories. He laughed, and then suddenly became very serious, and he told me that the only bad thing he had experienced during his time there was what had happened to the brother of one of the guys from the restaurant. One afternoon, after giving him a ride home on his motorcycle, the man crashed a few meters from the spot. An acquaintance from a stall set up close to the bridge ran to notify him immediately, and the poor brother went out desperately to look for him, to see what had happened. When he arrived, he found the most horrible scene of his life. His brother had been decapitated somehow, and this was terrifying for everyone involved. My uncle told me that they never fully recovered from it. I didn't know what to say to this. I felt a strange cold in my stomach, because I understood instantly that what I'd seen that night on the bridge was real. It had not been my imagination, and it had been no dream. It was a ghost, a last scream trapped in that place. And to this day, although I no longer live nearby, I know that I would never dare walk by there at night again. Night shift at Wendy's. From Dean. My Wendy's had its lobby open until midnight. After that, we'd remain open for another few hours, all until 3 in the morning, functioning exclusively as a drive-thru. I worked there for about 7 months, following the completion of a college degree. Ironic, I know, taking primarily night shifts. The night shift itself isn't bad, but it does attract a different demographic than usual. High school and college-age kids, drunk or otherwise intoxicated, were our main patrons, occasionally sprinkled in with families finishing up incredibly late road trips, as our location was near an interstate on-ramp. I only had one experience that I'd describe as strange. I mean, we've had freaky people show up, sure, but this evening was something special. An important note: at drive-thru speakers we can hear a lot. The microphones are tuned that way, so as to clearly and cleanly pick up a customer's voice. But with that, they also feed us everything from the gossiping of people in the back seat, to what you're playing on the radio, to crying children, to the sounds your idling engine makes. Basically, everything. And even further, at most locations nowadays, we also have video cameras attached. The one at my Wendy's was mounted well above the food menu, so it mostly just showed us the make and model of cars. It was helpful in the sense that it tracked motion and would give us an additional ping when a vehicle was detected, and also enabled us to better identify which order was going where in times of rush. Now that you know these details, I can recount my strange and unsettling experience. I think I clocked in around 10:30 p.m. We had very split duties in the sense that people would be rotated around during their shift, for example from front counter to drive-thru, which I appreciated to break the monotony. Anyway, I worked front counter for about 90 minutes, until we closed up the restaurant lobby. I remember this well, because I did have to get a particularly drunk older gentleman out with a very stern tone, as he was hovering around. I remember him spitting at me and dropping an empty can of seltzer before leaving, and I closed the door he exited out of with a very satisfying deadbolt click. Following that, I rotated myself over to the drive-thru. There were 3 other employees working alongside me. I believe 2 cooks and someone on janitorial. Anyway, time progresses pretty slow as I worked through a grand total of maybe 11 cars in half an hour. That was fairly status quo. So I'm hanging out near the pay window, which of course preceded the serve window. It might sound strange, but with the low volume of customers, I was pretty much serving both windows by myself. Not that I minded. I think I was on my phone at the time, just hanging out, when I suddenly looked up at the terribly low-quality monitor mounted above my head. That's when I see a car, directly at the ordering speaker. I find this strange because we didn't get a ping, at least not through my headset. I didn't hear a voice either, and the indicator light embedded on the camera display wasn't blinking, as if it detected nothing. Looking at the vehicle, it was fairly obvious it was a Crown Victoria, a Ford sedan that ended production back in 2011. Black, long, with simple curvature. Most Americans identify them very easily, as they were by far the most common cop car model for a long time. This one was unmarked, though. No lights or sirens, Just black. A civilian, I assumed. So I pull my microphone down and say my greeting spiel, asking them what they'd like to order. And I just get silence. No noise of any kind. I waited for 10 or so seconds, expecting the swoosh of an automatic window, only to get nothing. It was then that I noticed, bizarrely, I couldn't hear any engine noise. In fact, I could plainly pick up on ambient night wind, but no noises from the vehicle or anyone inside it. Keep in mind, albeit smaller than what you find in a Mustang, these Crown Victorias did have V8 gasoline engines. Typically, the speaker would pick up that kind of thing as they sat idle. But no, I heard and got nothing. So I check the camera again, and the polling timestamp on the video feed is up to date, so I know it hadn't frozen. Since I was serving the drive-thru previously, I also know that I hadn't seen that vehicle come through. But it's there, and live on the camera, albeit unresponsive. So I open my pay window, and I lean out, trying to see the vehicle in better resolution than what the little sensor camera offered. Only, as I lean out, I notice that there's nothing there. No car whatsoever. And so I pull my head back in and check the camera. But it's blank. Empty. The large black car that was absolutely there a second ago is now gone. Obviously, I'm a little weirded out. The way the drive-thru flowed, there's no way a vehicle could have left without driving by my window, unless it reversed out. And I'm not sure why they would have done that, as the street exit was so close. Even if they decided they didn't want anything, they could have easily driven by. But they didn't do that. They were just gone. Of course, I just assumed they'd backed out, and I missed them. I thought it strange, but carried on with my evening. I served maybe 2 more cars before deciding to quickly run to the restroom. When I tried the door to the employee restroom, it was locked, and I assumed the tiny toilet was either in use or being cleaned. So I headed instead to the lobby to use one of the public ones. Again, remember, it was probably 12:45 or so I expected no one to be in there. I'd only ever used the public washrooms during this drive-thru only time. I pass by the counter facing into the lobby on my way, and as I do, I notice a figure. I stop and I look closely. At a table on a raised platform with 4 or so other tables, right in the corner of the restaurant, there is a man. He's sitting there neatly. Slim, white, older, bald as far as I could tell. He's wearing a suit, like Fed style, black. And so I say, "Sir, we're closed right now," thinking I'd managed to leave a door unlocked, and he just wandered on in. But he ignores me. There's no indication that he heard me at all. He doesn't so much as move. Nothing is on the table. He's just staring straight ahead. So I move away from the counter and out the employee door leading into the lobby, preparing to ask him to leave. Just as I exit the door, legitimately seconds after seeing him, I look again, only to find his seat now empty. There's no sign of anyone at all. I look around, the raised area and the one below, out the windows. Heck, I even check under the tables, but nobody is there at all. As I go to peer out the doors and see if he left hurriedly, I confirm all the doors are actually locked. At this point, I feel a little nervous. I don't think I related the man to that car at the time, but even so, I just wasn't in the right headspace. It was really strange. He had 100% been there a moment before. But I carry on anyway. I use the restroom and return to my post. Now, are you familiar with the sound that cicadas or cicadas make? Like that low hummy chirp? As I have the headset on, only a few minutes after getting back, I begin to hear it. It's loud and droning. It wasn't unheard of for bugs to be attracted to our bright and glowing food menus at night. But this sounded like a swarm of big winged insects. Or at least, that's my closest approximation. Whatever it was, it sounded right next to the microphone. I peer at the camera, but I see nothing. The sound continues anyway. It gets louder and louder and louder. It really is quite ridiculous. I'd think the headset was malfunctioning if it wasn't for the occasional bleat and drop in sound. as if it really was a chaotic and organic swarm of bugs. But still, there's nothing on the camera. And it grows at a steady rate. I'm about to take the headset off, until it absolutely screeches. It's no longer a bug-like noise, but just raw nail-on-chalkboard style feedback. At the same time, the drive-through camera display grows bright. Ridiculously bright, like someone is shining a dang sun into the camera. Completely bright white, with the timestamp still rolling properly. So I rip the headset off, take a few paces around, and watch as the light vanishes from the display. It doesn't dissipate, and it doesn't fade. It's just completely gone, as if whatever had been emitting it had been wiped. I check my headset again. No weird noise. I think I had rationalized it at the time as some kind of low-flying plane that had its light angled directly into our drive-through camera. Obviously, that makes no sense, but it's what I rolled with. Now, I know what you're thinking. I should tell my coworkers about the weird happenings. And even though I didn't really know any of them, as we all came from different backgrounds and rarely socialized, I did want to at least see if they had anything weird happen to them that night. I went into the kitchen, and I found one of our cooks. He looked incredibly bored. Now, I get his attention, and I'm about to attempt to explain what had just happened, when another employee, the janitorial one I'd mentioned, comes in and says my name. I ask what he wants, and he says, since I have the headset, am I not going to take care of the car over in the drive-thru? Now, I didn't get a ping. I didn't hear a thing, but he says he had just dropped garbage out in the dumpster, and he saw a car waiting at the ordering speaker. So I rush back to my station, unable to tell my tale, because I'm giving our welcome greeting as I move. I finish right as I get to my window, though, and as I do, I look up at the display. And the vehicle that was there, the one my coworker had seen, was that black Crown Victoria. Of course, they don't answer me. There's no noise whatsoever. The car just sits there on my display still. I realize then that its headlights are not on. That wasn't something I'd noticed the first time, but the car is just dark, only the big mass of silhouetted steel visible, with no lights emitting. There's no idle noise in my headset, so I stay, watching it, not taking my eyes off the thing, and I raise my voice and call my coworker's name. Luckily, he hears me, and I quickly ask him to go outside and check if there's a car waiting in the drive-thru. He's confused and asks me if there's something wrong with the camera. I don't answer. Instead, I'm intently watching this car on the display. I didn't want to look away, lest it disappear again. I tell him once more, go out and look, and he does. The strangest clip I've ever seen on that camera then plays out. I hear the outside door to the drive-thru swing open as it's incredibly near my window. I see my coworker pass by, walking towards where the vehicle would be, and then he comes into view on the camera. I see him approach the car, directly in front of it, and then, I kid you not, I watch him walk into it, like directly through the grille and into the engine compartment. He stands there for a second, looking as if he'd sunk into the front of the vehicle itself and was waiting around in it, and then I watch as he keels over, almost lowering his head and upper body into where the car is on my screen, before he vomits loudly. Something I hear both over my headset and out the still closed window I was sitting behind. Right away, I rush out, taking the same door he did, and as I look down the narrow strip of road, I see no car at all, unlike what was clearly displayed on the camera. Instead, my coworker is sick, nearly on his knees, and vomits again. I rush over, asking if he's all right, and he's shaky. I can see sweat running down his forehead in the dim illumination of the drive-thru. He says he suddenly feels sick, like he got food poisoning, and so I help him inside. I sit him down and pour him a ginger ale from our drink fountain, which he thanks me for. And once he seems more collected, I ask him if there was any car outside, not mentioning the fact that I had just watched him wade into a big black sedan, his body somehow sharing the same space as the car. He says no, that there was no car out there at all. And then, as a follow-up, I ask him what the car he'd seen idling out there moments prior actually looked like. Very plain, he told me, in so many words, that he had seen the same black Crown Victoria. At this point, I am beyond freaked out. Even if my camera was just misbehaving, showing a car that wasn't there for whatever reason, I hadn't so much as uttered the model of it to anyone else. The fact that he had seen it himself, only when he took out the trash, was so strange. Not as strange as the fact that he had thrown up and gotten the shakes from walking through whatever that thing on my camera was. I had and still have no idea what that was. I don't tell him any of this, though. I mean, I would sound crazy, right? And before you ask, no, I can't rewind footage on my camera. The drive-through camera and the rest of the CCTV around the place recorded to a server, or whatever infrastructure only high-level employees had access to. So I return to my post and patiently sit. I'm almost ecstatic when a normal car comes by and places an order for a Baconator, or whatever it actually was. A few minutes after that's done, though, I hear a very loud, aggressive yell. Not through my headset, but instead coming from the lobby. I go out and I look. Keep in mind, the lobby is where my coworker who had just gotten sick and encountered the ghost car was sitting, still sipping his ginger ale. As I come out and ask what's up, I see him on 2 feet looking over across the restaurant to a corner. Immediately, I notice he's staring at the same corner in which I'd seen the suited man from before. My nerves certainly aren't soothed as he goes on to describe a similar sight. He said he was sitting there, drinking his soda, when he noticed a man in a dark suit sitting in the corner, identifying the same chair I did. He got up then, asking what the customer was doing inside the lobby, as it was well past 1 a.m. He says he got close enough to make out how old the guy was, remarking he was bald and light-skinned. Then he describes the man getting up, looking at him, and opening his mouth. Keep in mind this coworker of mine is emotional as he describes this. Anyway, instead of speaking, this man just kind of opened his mouth into a large circular gape, and as disgusting as it sounds, he said as the man's mouth opened, out came these giant, loud, flying bugs. I looked at him shocked. Immediately, I began saying I'd seen the same guy about an hour ago, and we confirm he looked exactly the same between the two of our stories. But then I ask about the bugs in detail, and all he can tell me, between colorful words and visible emotion, is that they were loud and just beamed at him. Then he specifies that he wasn't lying, not that I thought he was, and then he claims to have proof. I ask what he meant, and he points at the floor. And against the matte granite color of the tiles, there is an insect. I couldn't make it out because it was almost the same color as the floor, but it was there. It was a fat, rotund thing, huge, mind you, for a bug, about the size of my AirPods case, or a little bigger. The same kind of volume, too, like it was thick. At the time, Google Lens wasn't prevalent as it is today, so I couldn't take a photo and look it up. So I simply couldn't identify it. However, I do know that it was disgusting. He reiterates that a swarm of those things had come out of the suited man's mouth. Then he stomps on it. So we don't really know what to do. As bonded as we were over seeing the weird guy, I don't bring up the car. His English wasn't amazing, and I didn't know how to communicate the fact that I had seen him step inside the car without sounding absurd, so I didn't. Promptly, he tells me he's leaving for the night, that the place was sick, whatever that meant, and that he doubted he would ever be back. Not that it matters, but he was probably only 18 or so. Anyway, he leaves. I don't think he told the cooks, because again, no one really knew each other that well. I go back to my window. This is where things pick up. The cycle, if I can call it that, repeats itself. First, I serve an ordinary car. Great. Fine and dandy. And then, that darned Crown Victoria shows up on the camera. And it sits there. And it waits. I lean out my window to check if it's really there. And of course, it isn't. As soon as I come back in, it's gone from the monitor. Not so long later, my screen gets flashed again with blinding light, and along comes that same disgusting insectoid swarming noise. Another minute later, they pass. After the first repeat, I go tell the kitchen staff. These people are much older than me, one of them being my default manager, as we didn't have a manager in the skeleton crew early morning setup. And I don't want to look crazy, but I still mention that weird stuff is happening to my camera setup. I say that a freaky car keeps showing up, never ordering anything, and I leave it at that. They tell me that if a car is occupying the drive-thru without ordering, I should just ask them to leave. If they don't, at that point, I can call the police. I thank them. Of course, it happens again. Not so long after, either. It showed up, not rolled up or drove up, but again just appeared on my camera. I greeted it, or them, whatever, and they said nothing. And then I lean out and see nothing, and then the buzzing and lights come. Now, it might sound absurd, but it almost normalized. It became trivial. I knew how to deal with it. Maybe I should have gone home. I'm sure a lot of you would have in this situation. But I didn't. I sat there and dealt with it, because I wanted my money. My rationale then became that some guy was messing with me somehow, doing imperceptibly fast laps around my Wendy's, then somehow flashing a blinding light, playing absurd noises at my speaker in between his appearances. I really tried to feed myself this. Like, I knew something weird was going on, but I didn't care, or I didn't want to believe or acknowledge it. I just wanted to finish my shift and go home. Somehow, I knew, if I left early, that would just validate the creepy car more. And so I didn't. I persisted. And so did it. Maybe 6 cycles went by of the same darned thing. I stopped greeting it entirely. It made no difference to me. Oh, and in case you were wondering, no, there weren't any plates on the car. At least, none that I could see through my camera. No means of identifying it any further than make and model. Actually, it could have been a Grand Marquis or one of the other handful of cars that share the chassis. I really have no idea what exact car it was, as all I saw of it was that ridiculously low-quality drive-thru image. At the same time, the thought of the suited man in the lobby was eating at me. Like, my encounter was creepy, sure, but that gross, disgusting bug, and my coworker's account of a swarm of them pouring out of the man's mouth, that's just terrifying. So no, I don't go out there. I have no reason to, and I certainly have no desire to. I just keep serving the occasional real car and keep ripping off my headset as that noise comes by the speaker. I think maybe close to 2:15, it dies down, like completely. No car of any kind, spooky or otherwise, comes through, and so I take another bathroom break. To my dismay, the employee washroom still won't open. Realizing I have to head back into the lobby and use the public one, I get a little freaked out. But I promise myself, if I so much as see a glimpse of that man, I'll just scream and bring all the kitchen staff out. I pass by the counter and I see no one. I'm a little relieved, until I open the door. When I do, there's this most absurd feeling of a chill. Now, keep in mind the counter I had just passed by was open to the lobby. If it was cold in there, I would have felt it. But no, it only hits when I cross that door threshold. It's a ridiculous, burning and piercing cold, too. Like winter in Chicago while you're wearing short sleeves kind of cold. I look around, and back at the same table. This time, I see a woman. Now, trying to describe her is near futile, as I turned around and booked it back inside and towards the kitchen so quickly, but to the best of my knowledge, she was old. I recall gray hair. Her clothes, I don't know, black maybe. But I sprint into the kitchen, almost knocking someone over, telling them some weirdo was in the lobby. They both come with me. As we break into it, she's gone. Just gone. Nothing there. But the air, mind you, was still cold as ice. They both are wondering why too, and then get annoyed with me for bringing them out for no reason. So I apologize, feigning ignorance and silliness, before I quickly use that restroom and head back in with them. I'm now counting down the minutes until I can leave. At that point, I don't know where my rationale was. I think my logic center just went to sleep. There were maybe 1 or 2 cars over the next 30 minutes. Yes, real cars too. I serve them as usual. A little while later, I kid you not, it's 2:58. I'm so close to being able to leave when my headset pings. The camera indicator goes off, and on the camera, you guessed it, there was that black Crown Victoria. Only this time, it's slinking up. It's moving, driving, and it has headlights on. So I hold my breath. I mean, the car is common enough, right? Maybe this time it was just a real and normal person. I greet them, and in very concise English, a man orders 2 plain hamburgers. That's quite literally what he said, so I mark them up as our junior hamburger items and wait. The car keeps rolling, and it arrives at my window. Their window is up, total dark tint in the front, which I am pretty sure was illegal in my state, but yeah. The window rolls down, and I'm greeted by the exact man I saw in the lobby the first time. The one my coworker saw too, dressed in a suit. He's old, probably in his 70s, and bald. Next to him is this woman of equivalent age, dressed like she's about to go to a funeral. Whether or not she was the same one from the lobby from before, I could not be sure, as I had bolted so fast before. But naturally, I assumed it was. I look at them, dumbfounded, and he just hands me a $20 bill. He looks at me for a really long couple of seconds before the window rolls up. As it did, though, I swear inside the cabin of the car, I could see the occasional fat little bug zip back and forth as if flying around. The woman staring forward plainly, and the man staring at me. He didn't let me hand him his $16 or so of change. I'm literally dumbfounded and kind of shaky. Once I pick up the already finished bag from the kitchen's food slide, I take it over to the third window. But now the car is gone. They weren't waiting for their order, nor their change. The vehicle is just gone. I don't really know how to explain all of it, or what it meant if it meant anything. And yeah, I pocketed that otherworldly change, sue me, and I quit pretty soon after that, just because I got a better job with normal full-time hours. I still get a little freaked out anytime I see a car of that platform in black, though. Maybe someone out there might know more, if this is like some sort of urban legend I stumbled upon or something. But that's all I've got. The Late Night Terror from Lindo. Firstly, let me explain a few things. Here in South Africa, since the old days dating back to the 60s, there is a belief that there is an owner or ruler of certain places, such as big rivers or swamps. Most of these said owners are not humans, but creatures. And not just any creatures. It might be a big, dangerous snake, or any mythical creature you could think of, like mermaids or mermen and so on. It is believed that you cannot simply enter as you please at someone's territory. Over the years, there were incidents where people lost their lives at said places. So I also grew up knowing that we don't go swimming in some lakes, and there are people who say they saw these entities. These entities can take human forms as well to lure people where they shouldn't be. This story I'm sharing happened to my uncle. To be clear, it didn't happen at any big lake or river, but at a certain train station. At that train station, there was an entity who was believed to be looking after the station. Most people believed that the entity was the owner of the station. He used to work at a big train station, and that station had a certain rule. That is, at exactly 23:55, everyone must clear the station. Whether you're a security guard or you are a cleaner waiting for a train, all personnel must remain indoors until 0:15. It was said that the owner of the land the station was located on was passing by during this time. That rule must be followed, no matter what. He remembers it clearly. Back in 1994, still new to the job, his supervisor told him on his first day that there was a rule he must follow. At first, it may sound weird, but he would understand in the future if he still worked there. So yeah, he followed the rule as he was instructed. Nothing odd happened the first few weeks. This rule of remaining indoors every 23:55 to 0:15 every day did not sit well with him. So after he'd settled in at his new job as a night shift security guard, now knowing everyone's routine and everyone's business, he started digging for information. First was the cleaning crew. He asked, "I don't mean to be nosy and stuff, but does anyone care to tell me what's with the 11:55 rule?" That's what everyone called it, the 11:55 rule. But no one gave an answer. They just said, "Man, just follow the rule. We're just here to work, nothing more. Plus, we know nothing. We joined the company and the rule was already here when we got here." Even George, the old man who had been working at the train station for 25 years, told him to mind his business and just focus on his work. That made him want to dig even deeper. Eventually, he gave up on the idea. Then, one evening, curiosity got the better of him. He sat outside with his armchair and flashlight in hand. When the clock hit 23:45, everyone started to go back inside. But he just sat there, watching everyone go in. Some tried to talk him into going inside. But as he sat there, something felt off. Have you ever had the feeling that something wasn't normal, and your gut told you to run, but you chose to ignore it? Yeah, he had that feeling, but he ignored it. At exactly 23:50, the atmosphere changed. He felt a chill down his spine and something told him, "On your left, buddy." He looked slowly to his left, and he could only mutter, "Sweet Mother of Jesus." Yes, he saw it. Or rather, him. A man adorned in a full formal black suit, with a long coat reaching down to his knees, wearing a top hat. That's not the scary part, though. The man was not walking. Instead, he was floating in the air, 1 meter above the ground. He was going straight, but when he came into view, 10 feet from where my uncle was seated, he stopped for a few seconds. He then turned to face him. My uncle was known to be the brave one in his family, but the man adorned in full black, whose face he could not see, made him wet himself. On top of that, he was shaking like someone had poured ice water all over him. The man stood there facing him for what felt like ages, but was only about 10 seconds. Then, he continued on his way. After that encounter, my uncle resigned. He never took any more night shift jobs again. And the worst thing is, he doesn't feel okay telling anyone the story if it's nighttime, because every time he tells it, he feels like the man is somewhere close, watching him. Now, this following story was told to me by my mother. She was in her early teens when she had her encounter. I was 16 years old when one afternoon one of my friends, her name was Maria, the kind and friendly soul who loved church with all her heart, invited me to go with her family to attend a night gathering at their church. As naughty as I was, since I knew my mother wouldn't agree, I snuck out around 7 p.m. and ran to Maria's house, already dressed for church. When I got there around 7:30, we watched TV until around 10:30. That's when we left for the gathering, and it wasn't held at the main branch. It was held at a different branch, 3.5 hours of walking away. We walked, midnight hit. We were still a few miles away. To give you a clear picture, there were only 10 of us. Maria, her mother, her father, her young brother, their neighbors, and me. It was clear in the sky, full moon, no clouds. Me and Maria were walking at the back. Maria stopped to tie her shoelaces, and I took the opportunity to go into the little bushes at the side of the road to pee. It was only for a few minutes. As soon as we continued on our journey, the road was no longer empty. There were hundreds of people, it seemed, some adorned in church attire, some in casual clothes, and they were going the same direction as us. Nothing seemed odd to us teenagers, though, but the most distinct part of that moment was the sheer quietness. I mean, it was so silent, you could hear a pin drop. Maria and I rushed to her family. The moment we reached them, Maria's mom and dad and their male neighbor were praying. After they were done with the prayer, Maria asked her dad what was going on. Her dad didn't hide anything, he just said, but not out loud, "Maria, you see all the people around us? We were joined by 5 more people. The rest of the people you see are not alive. They are spirits." We were so scared that we kept quiet until we reached our destination. After this encounter, I never ran from home again. Maria herself never wants to talk about that night. Miss Pennyjoy, from April B. I graduated high school in the late 90s with a high GPA, a great scholarship to a good college, and complete academic burnout from my senior year. After a lot of discussion, my parents and the college agreed to let me take a year off and defer my scholarship. In the UK, they call this a gap year. Instead of using it to travel or volunteer, however, I wanted to use it to sleep, hang out, and experience life as a teenager without the worry of tests, deadlines, and essays looming over me. I got a job at a video store. I had a lot of movies to catch up on too, and I took on some babysitting jobs on the rare weekends I had off. While there were a few creepy stories from that job, this story centers on one of my babysitting gigs. Not long into that first summer, my mom told me that one of her colleagues at the hospital was being moved to second shift and needed someone to pick her daughter up from her day camps and watch her until she got home around midnight a few nights a week. She was willing to pay a staggering $5 an hour, unheard of money for a babysitter in those times. I jumped at the opportunity, and we set up a trial run the next week. The girl, we'll call her Lily, was a good-natured 11-year-old, having just entered her awkward phase, but not at the point where she had noticed yet. I picked her up from art camp with her mom and headed to the heart of town. They didn't live too far from us, though they lived in one of the large 19th century homes close to downtown that the town elites rather hopefully called the Garden District, in some attempt to give it an air of distinction. The homes in general were stately and beautifully kept, but the truth is, there were so few of them due to a tornado that passed through our town in the 1920s. Hardly any of them stood 3 in a row anymore. Lily's house was an exception, standing in a row of 5 antique houses. It was actually one of the oldest in town. Not a frilly Queen Anne or a stately columned Greek revival. It was a simple white 1850s farmhouse, rectangular, with a modest front porch and a large sleeping porch on the side. Downstairs, a great room, parlor, now the master bedroom, dining room, bathroom, and tiny kitchen. Upstairs were 2 bedrooms and a bathroom, which were Lily's domain as a lucky only child. I had passed by it many times while walking to the library, but had not given it much notice because of its more interesting neighbors. I'd like to say that when I stepped onto the front lawn, I felt some kind of chill in the air or some sort of heavy feeling, but in fact, everything was perfectly normal. I got a tour, and her mom said she would go out to run errands and be back in a few hours. That afternoon flew by. I aced the interview, pocketed my $20, and went home, excited to start the next week. As the summer wore on, Lily and I got to know each other well and settled into a routine. I often brought movies for us to watch together as a treat for her finishing her chores. I loved showing her some favorites from my childhood, like Goonies and Flight of the Navigator. It wasn't until the 4th of July that our routine was interrupted. I had just gotten back from my shift at the video store, a slow night, when Lily's mom called to tell me that she was going to have to go in on her day off. The ER was more packed than usual. Lily's father was supposed to have her, but had switched weekends to go on a fishing trip. She asked me if I could watch her overnight for double pay and popcorn and pizza. She didn't have to ask me twice. Popcorn and pizza and double pay when I'd mostly be sleeping? Sounded like a great deal. I hadn't made any plans for the night since my shift ended after all the fireworks anyway, and I hate getting to parties after everyone's been drinking for a while. I got to Lily's at the same time as the pizza and saw her mom off. As I mentioned before, Lily had the entire upstairs to herself. One of the rooms was her bedroom, and across the landing there was the bathroom and another bedroom, which had a sofa, television, some beanbag chairs, and Lily's desk. A swanky setup for an 11-year-old, right? After we watched Casper for the 10th time, Lily swooning over Devon Sawa the entire time, she went to sleep in her room, and I settled down on the sofa with American Beauty and drifted off. As I said before, even though the house was old and plain, it never spooked me out, even at night. It was creaky as all old houses are, especially creaky to be honest, as it had a marked tilt to the south from settling into the earth. One game Lily and I played was racing marbles and bouncy balls from one end of the room to the other in her lounge. Even so, creaky as the house was, I slept like a log through all the house's moaning and groaning, and even the errant firework. But after the sun rose, I could tell from the light creeping through my closed eyelids. The floorboards in the room started creaking like someone was pacing up and down along them. I thought it might be Lily looking for something, so I just kept my eyes closed, pretending to be asleep, so she wouldn't ask me to help her. I wasn't ready to wake up yet, but the sound kept on for so long, and it seemed like the person wasn't actually moving around the room, but pacing right in front of the sofa. I was facing the back of the sofa, so I couldn't see any shadows, but I could feel their closeness. "Lily," I said, "are you okay, hun?" The pacing suddenly stopped, and in that moment I opened my eyes, looking at the plaid tweed of that old sofa, the hair standing up all over my body, just like the fibers of its worn surface. Whoever or whatever that was, it didn't feel like Lily. I swallowed, sat up, and turned around. Nothing, and the presence was gone. The room felt as empty as it looked. I quickly got dressed and went into Lily's room. Her bed was made. I went downstairs to see if she was eating breakfast, realizing I had no idea what her morning routine was. On the table was a note from Lily, saying she had gone to spend the morning with a friend. They'd left over an hour ago. The house felt very still, very quiet, but again, not at all heavy or wrong. I called her mom to confirm the playdate, locked up, and left, making a note to ask some questions the next time I came over. The next time I babysat, I asked as casually as possible if the house had any weird history. Lily squinted at me, then nodded sagely. "You saw her then?" "Saw her?" "The lady." "Well, I didn't see anyone," I said, "but it did seem like there was someone in the room, someone watching me." "She was probably checking you out," Lily said. "She didn't do anything bad, did she?" "No, just woke me up, pacing." "Yeah, she does that. She's just worried. She looks out for me, surprised it took so long for you to see her, or hear her." "Why does she look out for you?" "Well, I always wondered too. So last year I went to the library and looked at the microfiche and stuff. Did you know there used to be nothing around the house when it was built? Crazy to think about. Anyway, there was a bunch of houses in 1928 when that big tornado hit. See that lot across the street? That whole block where there's just one house?" She pointed. "There used to be 4 houses there. The couple who lived here had kids who were over there playing when the storm hit and wiped out 3 of those houses. Almost everyone in them died, including the kids. She never got over it, and she died of a broken heart. So I think she stayed around to look after the children who lived here after. Do you know what her name was?" "Penelope Joy. Isn't that a pretty name? Penny Joy?" "Yeah, I think so. And you think she likes me?" "Yeah. And you know, I bet she was worried you'd be worried since I left without saying goodbye the other day." "Yeah, that was a little thoughtless of you." "I was trying to be thoughtful and not wake you up." "Well, kudos for trying." Lily's mom soon after went back to day shift when the school year started, so I only babysat Lily occasionally after that, but we kept in touch. When Lily was 14, her mother remarried, and they welcomed a new baby. Lily wasn't too happy about giving up her awesome living arrangements right as she went to high school, but when her mother offered to give her the enormous downstairs bedroom in exchange, she couldn't resist. I asked if Pennyjoy was looking after the baby now. She laughed at me and said, "Of course she is." Encounters, again on your favorite podcast apps. I've always liked those stories about I was the target. From Mads07. I hail from a well-known UK city known as Colchester. Yes, it has the same name as the infamous Colchester Underpass, where the Bunny Man supposedly stalks. Unfortunately, we don't have any urban legends as renowned as that, unless you count the claims of people seeing spectral figures around old Roman settlements. But my story is different than that. For privacy reasons, I'll be changing the names of any places and people involved that I might mention. For some background information, I was a full-time college student, so I took up a part-time job at a local pub to learn some bartending skills to help me at university. The pub I worked at was small, very secluded, and old, dating back to the early 16th century, and still holds up to this day. Most customers you get are the ones that are local to the area. Any others are a bonus. I tended to work the day shifts. They're quiet, which is what I prefer, as I can get most chores done, plus the hours are more set. I didn't like the night shifts mainly because they were rowdier, and you weren't sure whether you would get off at 8 p.m. or at midnight. Now, to get to the part you're all interested in. I was not supposed to work the night shift that night. I was called up last minute, as the person who was supposed to be there called in sick. As much as I didn't want to do it, I knew I couldn't say no. Plus, think of the money, as my mom would always say. My shift started at 6. Mom dropped me off and said Dad would pick me up when I was ready. The shift went, unfortunately, as expected. Not only were most of the locals there, but also the Irish farm workers, who were infamous for drinking their weight in Jamesons and Guinness, and would often not leave until the absolute last second before closing. My boss was out for the night, so I was on my own. Less to say, I wasn't the happiest of workers, mainly polishing cutlery unless someone asked for a drink, trying to drown out most of the boisterous yells coming from the pool table behind me. It was like that for most of the night. It wasn't until going on 11 o'clock that I was able to persuade everyone out the door, so I could start the lockup jobs. The pub was left in a deafening silence once the final customer left, something I was always uncomfortable with. To distract myself, I turned my attention to the standard jobs you would do when locking up a restaurant: sweeping the floors, cleaning the glasses, emptying the ashtrays, etc. It wasn't until I went to check the bathrooms that the first incident happened. I was cleaning the mirrors hung over the sink when an explosive sound rang out from the bar area. The sort of sound that echoes and forces you to clutch your ears in pain. I was terrified. Like most people, my fight-or-flight response kicked in. I began imagining the worst scenarios possible, such as the possibility that a whole shelf of drinking glasses fell, or a more sinister act caused by an intruder. This sound did not cease, but instead grew progressively louder. Despite the pain in my ears, I had to stop whatever was causing the sound before the whole village woke up. I sprinted to the bar, expecting to see shattered drinking glasses strewn across the floor. There was nothing. Now, you might think I would be relieved, but if anything, I was more terrified, because the sound was still going, and there was no obvious sign of where it was coming from. After frantically looking for any sign of disturbance, I found that it was coming from the speaker. I yanked the plug from the power socket and was left with immediate silence. Well, silence from an environmental perspective. I can still remember the palpitations of my heart ramming like a jackhammer against my ribcage, sending tremors throughout every nerve of my body. I hunched over the bar to give myself time to decompress, to come back to some kind of homeostasis. My brain was in a daze and could barely contemplate what had just happened. After taking in a few deep breaths, I began to calm down, and my thoughts became clearer. But I still had no logical answer to what had just occurred. In the end, I decided it was due to some technical issue that was beyond my understanding, and I went back to my duties. I decided to leave the bathrooms until last, focusing on sweeping in the bar and restaurant area. Personally, I don't mind sweeping. It helps me to think, allows my internal monologue to rant about any number of things. It wasn't long after I calmed down from the first incident that the second one occurred. Just to put it out there, I'm not one to completely believe in superstitions or the paranormal. However, I refuse to go near Ouija boards or dabble in conjuration. But it was this incident that made me believe otherwise. The deafening silence once again plagued my ears. The only comfort I received was the sound of bristles on hard floor and the scraping of dirt. But then my ears pricked up, the hairs on my body stood up, and my sweeping ceased. A third sound could be heard, but it was not coming from me. Slow creaks with deliberately timed pauses between each one could be heard on the floor above me. The sound of footsteps creaking slowly towards the upstairs staircase, which fed into the kitchen and eventually the restaurant where I currently stood. It was as if something was taunting me. Someone or something was purposefully trying to frighten me. It worked. My flight response took a hold of me, so I dropped the broom and ran out of the pub into the front patio. Sensing my movements, the slow, deliberate creaks above suddenly changed into a fast-paced sprint, which bellowed throughout the pub. I was being chased. Boom, 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 boom. The booming footsteps collided with concrete from the kitchen. But I was already out the door, running around the side of the pub into the back garden. The garden looked sinister, with the black silhouette of the trees and bushes, contrasting against the pale moonlight. The spiny branches of the bushes welcomed me as I dove underneath the shrubbery and tumbled down into a trench, the thorns scraping the bare skin on my arms and ankles. Not long afterwards, I heard heavy footfalls contacting with dried leaves and other shrubbery, as it also must have made its way round the side of the pub and was now seeking me out. Sprawled out across the ground, face down, my chest and other body parts dug into the dead pieces of wood from fallen branches. I wanted to flatten myself down as much as possible. I dared to not risk a shadow in fear of that thing finding me. I felt like I was suffocating due to the pressure on my chest as well as the adrenaline. My lungs were not in sync with my heart rate, but I refused to let my rapid breathing give me away. I lay there, unmoving, forcing myself to hold my breath, only allowing a couple of short breaths to prevent me from passing out. The rustling of footsteps paced slowly and tauntingly around the perimeter of the garden, like how a predator circles its prey before the attack, a form of torture targeting the fight or flight response. It knows I'm here, I thought. I know it's here, but only one of us has the upper hand over the other. I wish I could truly convey the feeling of powerlessness I felt when faced with something that unfathomable, but that's only a feeling those who have experienced it can understand. The pacing continued, but a sudden stumble a couple meters from where I lay sent every muscle in my body into action mode. It was the sudden move someone does when they do a double take, like when they saw something. The footsteps quietened, as if it was trying to conceal itself, but instinct told me of the thing that I feared most, the whispers of footsteps growing closer. I heard heavy, raspy breathing. Terrified it was mine, I clasped my hand over my mouth and nose, but I quickly realized it was not coming from me, but from something right above me. The bush was now the only barrier between me and it, a faint shadow cast over the moonlight earth in front of me, the breathing, grating, and guttural announcing its presence. I engaged every muscle in my body, ready to make the run for my life. Rapid and savage rustling came from the bush, as if the leaves themselves started battling and tearing at each other. It was trying to get through. Whether what I did next was a good idea or not, I couldn't tell you. All logic and sense of reasoning left me, and I could only count on my primitive instincts to get me away, anywhere away from this thing. I sprinted from the trench, exiting through a gap, and headed towards the road. The sound of running quickly followed me, as I expected it would do. I was still being chased. Retracing my steps, past the side of the pub, I let my legs take me anywhere, just anywhere. The sprinting behind me did not falter. It was determined. I could hear the paces catching up to me with every stride, with every rasp of breath that echoed throughout my ears. As one last-ditch effort, I forced my lungs to fill with air, ready to scream. But at the 11th hour, by the skin of my teeth, at the last gasp, I heard a car revving down the country road. The full beam of light came into complete view as it blinded and halted me to a complete stop. The sprinting behind me had also stopped, and a rapid rustle to the side of me was heard. Standing on the edge of the road I was about to run on, I saw the recognizable beige paint job of an old Maverick. My dad's car! The feeling of relief and gratitude I felt was beyond anything I've ever known. Dad pulled up beside me, and I immediately raced to the front seat door on the other side and got in, locking the door as I did so. Panting, I clipped my seatbelt on and waited for my dad to drive away. The car didn't move. I turned to him shaking and out of breath. "Aren't you going to drive?" I said, with too much scold. But he only looked at me unblinkingly, a look of disapproval and concern on his face. "What happened to your arms?" He scolded back at me. I remember sitting there still trying to catch my breath, and I looked at my arms. The cuts from the thorns were much deeper than I thought, but more importantly, I had to check if that thing was still there. I bent forwards, looking out my dad's side window. Nothing. Gone like a wisp of smoke, like it was never there in the first place. Dad followed my gaze, confusion added to his already darkened face. "What are you looking at?" I snapped out of my trance and pointed outside as a form of gesture. I tripped and fell behind the bushes. There was a trench there and I struggled to get out, and that's what happened. I'm okay though, just a little shaken up, since it was dark and everything. The look on my dad's brow slacked a little, but not completely. He rolled his eyes and put the car in gear and we drove off. Once we were a couple 100 meters away, I looked out the back window, and I could have sworn I saw a looming dark figure watching us as we drove away. Why didn't you tell your dad the truth? You're probably all thinking. The short answer, my dad is very much a skeptic. He believes in nothing supernatural. Even if I did tell him what happened, he would not have believed me, and would instead think I was chased by some deranged man and would try to get the police involved. I did consider it. Talking to the police, I mean. But something in my instincts told me that what I experienced was not human, so the police would not have been able to do anything. Once home, I immediately went upstairs to my room. After checking that the windows were locked, I collapsed onto my bed. I didn't bother changing into my pajamas. Despite feeling heavier than a sack of lead, it was a long time before I could fall asleep. Every time I closed my eyes, the echoing of a guttural breathing and fast-paced footsteps plagued my ears, forcing my brain to imagine it repeatedly. Like a cyclical loop, it was a never-ending narrative, but nature eventually took its course. My tiredness and exhaustion must have taken over me as my mind went blank. The next morning, I woke up to an angry message from my boss, who was reprimanding me for not locking up the building before leaving. Before you judge him, you need to see it from his perspective. I was negligent. It's not like he saw the events that went down. If I did tell him, he would assume that I was making up an excuse, trying to take him for a fool. Or he might think it to be a human and try to call the police as well. Both were outcomes I didn't want to face. But luckily, he's a reasonable guy. Once I sent an apology and promised him that it was an accident and that it would not happen again, he forgave and forgot quickly. But it was a while before I went back to the pub, and that was only because my mom wanted to visit. It was light and full of people, so I didn't feel as terrified to walk in. But the hairs on my body still stood up, like there was some kind of presence. We were there for a couple of hours, my mom doing most of the talking as she's more familiar with the locals. But I did get into a conversation with a regular called Jamie. It was mostly small talk, mainly me discussing what university I was going to and what I planned to do when I got there. It was like that for a while, until the conversation took a turn that I did not expect and never would have. For some quick background information, Jamie is an old soul who has lived in the village for many decades. He knows the ins and outs of its history, even the far-fetched stories passed down from past residents. "I heard you forgot to lock up the pub before you left," Jamie chuckled. "News spreads quick when you work at a pub." "Yeah," I replied with a forced smile. "Not the best way to end your last shift, is it, girl? Oh well, guess your tiredness got the better of you. Or maybe that ghost was winding you up." I felt my body freeze, and I stared at him blankly. Tiny words eventually escaped my lips. "Ghost? What ghost?" "Have you never heard? This pub is supposedly haunted. Quite a few people have experienced strange events happening in here, late at night usually." I sat up taller. "What events? Like physically seeing a figure?" "Nah, nothing like that. Little things like creaking floorboards or flickering lights. Even the radio has turned itself on a couple of times, but nothing serious." Jamie chuckled as he said this, but I didn't. If anything, it made me feel worse. Feel vulnerable, as for some reason I was the one that was targeted. "It's probably just a bunch of stories," Jamie spoke. "But hey, if you want to see some kind of figure, walk out to the restaurant area and look at the pub family photo on the wall. Furthest window to the right." I quickly rose from my seat and walked to where he described. I squinted at the photograph, which was in black and white, despite it only being from 2010. "I can't see anything," I called back. "Use the light on your phone," Jamie answered. Turning on the torchlight on my phone, I hovered it over the far right window within the picture. And that's when I saw it. Very faintly, the shadow of a contorted face within darkness that replicated a menacing glare, staring right back at me. Ironic, isn't it? No matter how many horror movies we watch, no matter how many times we shout at the characters on the screen to run away, we allow the dramatic irony to get the better of us. Yet we cease to follow our own advice when dealing with the paranormal, and try to decipher everything with logic instead of just trusting our instincts. From my time at university thus far, one thing a professor taught me is that not everything can be proven, and not every hypothesis will have a logical conclusion at the end of it. You can either accept the outcome and move on, or try a different method to yield different results. My point being, maybe some things are meant to stay mysteries. Some things are better kept uninvestigated for our own safety, unless you want to attract unwanted attention from a force far superior to us. Well, that's about the end of my anecdote. Whether you believe it or consider it as another counterfeit ghost story, that's up to you. I'm still not entirely sure what happened to me that night. Maybe there is a logical, scientific explanation to what happened. But regardless, the paranormal is not something to mess with, despite what you choose to believe in. I'm about to head into my second semester of my first year at university. That means exams. Hopefully I'll have a better experience than what I had at the pub. Good luck to all those part-timers out there. A word of advice, always follow your instincts. The sound in the walls of a hotel. From Rosie. My boyfriend Pete and I work together. Our work requires us to travel sometimes. We go together whenever our schedules align. Pete was sent to go to a smaller town a couple of hours away from where we live. It's really popular for its cottage life and resort. It's very pretty. I've only heard of how posh and pretty it was, but never had the opportunity to go myself. But he said he had to go for an overnight, and asked if I wanted to join. Well, of course I did. Everything ran smoothly throughout the day, until we started to settle into our hotel. We had a suite, so it came with a kitchenette. The hotel was quiet when we checked in, as if we were the only ones in it. Which I guess isn't too strange during off-season in cottage country or a town. When we were checking in, Pete was in and out of meetings virtually, so I had to end up doing a lot of the unpacking. I had to make a couple of trips, so I'd been in the only 2 elevators in the building a few times already. On the last ride to get to my floor, I ran into an older lady who was getting on the elevator. She said to me, "I guess we aren't the only ones on the floor." She laughed as I got off. I simply replied, "I guess we'll see you around." Later that evening, I needed something from the car. When the elevator came, it was one I knew I'd taken before, but I noticed now that there was a rear door to it. I thought it was strange. I was sure that door wasn't there before. When I got out to my car, the mood was eerie. I'm sure the cloudy skies and the tiredness and hunger weren't helping much. When I got closer to my car, I saw the groundskeeper sweeping up garbage. I smiled and said hello, which he ignored, not even flinching as I got closer. I checked it off as strange but went on. After grabbing everything I needed, I locked my car when I noticed another groundskeeper walking 2 dogs. I said hi again with a smile. He also ignored me, but one of his dogs looked at me. There was no excitement in that look, just curiosity, like I was another pole on the street. I headed back in, and when I did, another guest was walking their dog. He didn't seem to notice me when I looked at him in an empty parking lot. It was starting to feel unsettling with all of these strange one-off encounters. When I got back to the room in a no rear door elevator, I started to make dinner. Pete was still working at the time. I told him that I'd discovered we had older neighbors, so we should be mindful of our noise. He said he heard them moving around earlier. Maybe 3 minutes later, we heard knocking on the wall we shared. It sounded like something we definitely should be minding our business about. Pete and I looked at each other and laughed. A few minutes later, we heard it again and laughed once more, talking about how thin the walls were here, except this time, we heard tapping towards the ceiling. We were on the top floor. There was no one above us. Pete came up with some excuse like hotel settling, but we both didn't fully buy that. I took a shower while Pete cleaned up. I made sure to close the door so I wouldn't feel a draft after the shower. When I finished up, I tried to open the door, of course, but it felt like it was locked. I was sure I had not locked it. Why would I? I called out to Pete to help me open it. Luckily, he easily opened it up. He asked me if I was okay, figuring that the door must be set weird. I mentioned to him that I wasn't comfortable with this hotel. We both agreed to leave this hotel first thing in the morning. Now, I was really craving some chocolate, so Pete and I went to the hotel shop. The front desk lady did not make eye contact even when we approached the desk. She looked up as soon as Pete started talking. She looked really robotic and shifty. This wasn't work exhaustion. It was more like she had switched into someone else. Now, something about Pete is that he is very much a people person. He can make friends anywhere, anyhow. It's not uncommon for some young ladies to assume he's flirting, but the way she reacted and talked, she was so lifeless. It was strange for both of us. And no, I'm okay with other girls who try to flirt. Pete is good at setting up boundaries. Sometimes it works out better for us when he gets us better deals. Anyway, we both thought this was weird and walked away from the desk, sort of creeped out. Around 4 a.m., I woke up and had a hard time falling back asleep. I decided to go to the couch to do some reading. Before I sat down, I got a glass of water and looked outside the balcony. There was a small boathouse-like building, well kept, that was probably a small hangout spot for guests. It wasn't strange for buildings like this to have the lamps or lights on, and the lights were on, I noticed, with the wide curtains drawn. Suddenly, the shadow of a human figure appeared at the window. It was like looking at a drawing, though. It didn't look like a normal human-shaped shadow. It stood at the windows, but then walked away. I was really creeped out by this. I quickly went back to bed, accidentally waking Pete up for a second, but he went back to sleep after, but not before I buried my face into Pete. No matter how hard I tried that night, all the little noises kept me up until it was time to go. Needless to say, I was packed and ready to go before Pete said good morning. He joked about how this was the first time I'd gotten ready before him. I don't know if I'm comfortable with him going alone on these trips anymore. At the same time, I don't know if I want to do these trips with him anymore. I sure won't be coming back here. Black magic is very real. From Blessed Blister. I'm a 23-year-old woman from India. When I was around 20, I left my hometown to go study in a quaint suburban coastal town, which I came to love quite quickly. I soon found a hostel close to my university and rented out a room for myself. This was a room for 2 people, but I wasn't too keen on having a roommate, so I decided to pay extra and keep the room all to myself, something I would soon come to regret. When I moved in, I found a tiny doll made with cotton. It had been left behind in the cupboard by the previous tenant. I thought it was cute, and I didn't want to throw it out, so I just let it be. Pretty soon I settled in, though the first couple of days I found it difficult to fall asleep. But the sheer amount of work at the university soon after would leave me so exhausted that I would just come back and crash. This one time, though, there was some kind of protest happening in the town, so we were given about 2 weeks off. During this time, I lazed around, catching up on TV series and movies, barely leaving my room except at mealtimes. My days would just go by in a blur, but when night fell, that's when things started to happen. I hadn't noticed before, but as I lie awake in bed one night, sluggish but not sleepy, I saw a shadow bounce around on the wall. When I say shadow, I mean it was more of a dark shape with no features, moving around quickly from one corner of the room to the other. The window in my room was right at the foot of my bed, and it overlooked the street. So my first thought was that it was probably the shadow of a car or some other vehicle passing by, even though I hadn't heard the sound of a vehicle pass. But when your mind wants to rationalize things, it has a way of sticking to it and dismissing something unreasonable. So that's what I thought, and I shrugged it off. Every single night, this shadow showed up. Sometimes it would hover near the window for a while, then move to and fro between the walls. It got so frequent that I got absolutely used to it. I didn't get a negative vibe or anything from it, and at one point it was even quite peaceful to look at while dozing off. One night, however, something changed. It was like a switch was flipped, and the atmosphere in the room just became very, very dark. I was so used to being in my room now that I was very comfortable. But that night, as I turned the lights off, there was a sense of inescapable dread that I'd never felt in there before. I couldn't quite place why I was feeling that way, and no matter how hard I tried to relax, I found it difficult to breathe, like I was on edge and something terrible was going to happen. Then came the shadow, doing what it did as usual, but this time, it came closer. It wasn't near the window anymore. It hovered right over my bed, frantically moving all over the walls around me. This was unnerving because it felt malicious, like the shapeless shadow thing wanted to attack me. I shut my eyes for a minute, hoping it would go away, and when I opened them, the shadow wasn't hovering anymore. Instead, it was now stagnant, standing tall as a dark mass right in front of my window. The light from the window stood out around it, illuminating it. I was absolutely frozen in terror. Some part of me wanted to scream, but I couldn't even function. This black silhouette with no discernible features just seemed to pulsate. It came closer and went back, as if trying to break some kind of invisible barrier between me and it. For some reason, it could not get close to me, and in that moment, that meant everything. I quickly sat up in bed, panicking and hyperventilating. It was still there, now moving frantically around my bed, trying to edge its way into me by all means. I keep idols of the Lord Shiva and the goddess Kali. They're on my bedstand, and the only thing I could think to do at the time was to clutch those idols close to me. As I did that, the shadow figure seemed to pause for a minute, but it resumed its grotesque shadowy dance, more fiercely now, leaving me a terrified mess huddled in my own bed, crying my eyes out. At some point, I think the sheer exhaustion from the stress took over, and I finally nodded off, still holding onto those idols, keeping them close to my chest. As soon as the sun came up, I was jolted awake. I ran downstairs to find the warden, not caring that it was still early in the morning. In between sobs, I managed to tell her what happened as coherently as I could. Thankfully, she did not dismiss my story. She immediately called in a priest to come check out the room. When the priest came by, he sat in the room going into some kind of meditative trance for a while. When he opened his eyes, he looked at me, asking me if there was anything in the room that did not belong to me. It didn't come to me right away, but then I thought about that doll, the one I'd found in the cupboard when I'd moved in. I told him that, and I went and found it to show it to him. He took a deep breath and said a few shlokas, or incantations, while pulling out spools of sacred thread smeared in turmeric. He wrapped the doll in the thread completely and slowly took it out, placing it in his bag. He told me and the warden how this doll was a medium of black magic, one that had summoned a Chudale or a witch. According to legend, the Chudale is a vengeful spirit of a woman who has died an unnatural death. The priest said that whoever had made and left this doll had dipped it in the blood of some poor woman who had passed recently. This had invoked the Chudale to wake up and inhabit the doll. The only reason it could not attack me was perhaps because of the idols I had next to my bed, and the more I held on to them, the Chudale could not come near me. The priest said he would go burn the doll in a holy fire altar. He gave me a talisman to wear all the time. I shifted to another room while the warden did a puja, or ritual, in this one, to cleanse it of any negative energy. Till this day, that has been the scariest, most terrifying experience in my life. And no matter where I go, even to this day, I make sure to carry my idols with me. Angel or Demon, from Thick McChick. This was my second nursing job, and was considerably different than the first, which was a rehabilitation and mental health care facility. This was a juvenile detention facility. Yep, a kids' jail. Now, I was not nearly as intimidated by this as I admittedly should have been. I figured my position was in the wellness department, and that containing combative children would be the support staff's responsibility, since they were specifically trained for this. I just needed to attend to the children's health concerns, and do the medication passes, and basically tend to my own affairs and business. With that in mind, I began my job as a nurse in a juvenile detention facility. Children acting absolutely buck wild was nothing new to me. My very first day, a teen boy from the offender cottage, if you catch my drift, was brought to an intake cell through the Sally Port, and held there in one of the cells until the nursing staff could assess him. When myself and the nurse who had been training me got there, we had to do an evaluation on him to see the level of severity of his injuries. That way we could treat and document them. This lad had repeatedly slammed his forehead against the inside of his intake cell and had managed to get about a quarter-sized goose egg on his forehead. It wasn't very pretty, but I would find things like this, although certainly not common, but they weren't rare either. I kinda had a baptism by fire first shift. Welcome to the jungle. I was the evening shift nurse when she came through intake that night. A chubby little cherubic 8-year-old girl, shuffling over and sitting down in one of our chairs, looking scared and forlorn. Her messy, loose, dark brown curls hung midway over her chestnut brown eyes. For this story, I'll call her Angel. The facility services manager asked if she could stay with me for a while, since the kids had decided that Saturday evening was a perfect time to riot. He and the support staff had their hands more than full. Of course, she could sit over by my nurse's station, and I'd keep a watchful eye on her. My evening med pass was done, so it wasn't really a problem. She was a literal babe in the woods. She was apprehensive and appeared to be somewhat overwhelmed. I couldn't imagine being in holding as an adult, let alone an 8-year-old little girl. She had to be terrified. To her credit, she never cried, never whined. Honestly, she impressed me with her level of maturity and awareness. Maybe since hindsight is 2020, I miscalculated her maturity and awareness for what it actually was: disconnect and apathy. I clocked out at 10 p.m., and it was approaching that time. The kids did not stop rioting just because I was going home soon, so the manager and support staff were still swamped. Angel was quietly sitting in her chair, continuing to nod off with her little brown bouncy curls, framing her round, sweet, pretty little face with pinkish red cheeks and big doe eyes. I decided, since I was leaving soon, to lay her down in a cot in the infirmary and just let her sleep. It was almost 10, and she's 8 years old. She'd had a very emotional day. She had to be exhausted, I thought. I lay her down in the cot after I fluffed up her pillow, and I grabbed her a couple of blankets out of the warmer to tuck her in. She practically fell asleep as I explained to her that the intake staff were just a few feet away, and if she needed anything, just go to them. That was my introduction to Angel's heavenly side. I don't remember how long it took for me to see Angel's demonic side, but I do know that it didn't take very long. To be on a med pass and see her in the throes of an all-out nuclear-level meltdown was really a shock to the system. The support staff had several men who were between 6 and 6.5 feet, and between 250 to 300 pounds. The first time I saw Angel kicking, screaming, biting, and hitting, while 4 men of this size and 2 women of a much smaller stature tried to restrain her, I was in a complete state of shock. Keep in mind, I had worked as a surgery tech for 10 years in labor and delivery before I went back to nursing school, so I like to believe that I've seen my fair share of kicking, bucking, and fighting. In all honesty, very little shocked me at this point. What did shock me, though, the quickness in which Angel morphed into a kicking, screaming, biting, unholy terror when she felt slighted in any way, or heard the word no when she demanded something, because she rarely requested anything. So I was on my evening med pass to the inside cottages. To give you a clearer visual, we had cottages inside the fenced-in area of the facility, and a cottage outside of the fenced-in area. The cottage where Angel was housed was one of the inside cottages. The cottage had all of the kids in their rooms in a lockdown state due to Angel having a full-on meltdown, and the support staff were trying to get her under control. I decided to come back to that cottage once things had calmed down, and the kids weren't confined to their rooms. As I was exiting the cottage, Angel was being restrained right by the door that I needed to exit. 6 full-grown adults were trying to restrain this 8-year-old little girl so she wouldn't be a harm nor hazard to herself and others. She was bucking like a bronco, screaming, thrashing around, using foul language that I didn't even know when I was her age. She was threatening staff, too. I looked at her face and into her eyes as I was leaving. It stopped me dead in my tracks. This child looked completely different than the chubby, cherubic little girl that I tucked in on her intake evening. Her pupils were so dilated that the chestnut brown iris of her eyes was now jet black. She had very little white sclera showing at all. This wasn't just low-light pupil dilation either. The black dang near took over the entire eye. Her voice unnerved me the most. It was guttural and deep, like a man's voice. She no longer sounded like a girl or a little girl. And the hatred, that hatred that accompanied that glare, was beyond disturbing. It was downright scary, and I do not shake easily. My gut instinct was just to get away and to do so quickly, and that is precisely what I did. I finished up my med pass to the other cottages and came back to Angel's cottage. Upon my return, I learned they took her to intake, where she was placed in a cell. She hurt herself during her outburst, and that's putting it very lightly, and I would need to do a physical assessment and report on her injuries when I got back to the wellness department. So with apprehension, I headed to wellness to drop off my med bag and head to the intake department, which was right next to wellness. I get there, and I'm told Angel really flipped out when she was placed in her cell. She, like the boy on my first day, also banged her head repeatedly against the cell walls and got a goose egg on her forehead. This was a common occurrence for any of the youths that were placed in a cell as a form of revolting against being put there, but at least there they couldn't harm the staff and other inmates. I entered her cell with apprehension as she sat with slumped shoulders on the concrete bench in a straitjacket. Gone was the hellacious demon that was kicking, hitting, biting, and bucking the support staff with obsidian eyes and a voice full of manly bass. Before me sat a broken and bewildered little girl, just like the cherubic child I saw on her first night here, looking up at me with pain and sorrow, regret, and a huge red and pink knot smack dab in the middle of her head. Granted, you'd be correct in thinking the little girl's confused look was from her conking her head. That was a tiny part of it, though. This child looked like she was lost and didn't know what was going on. I asked her the typical questions of what hurt and where, so I could properly document and treat her injuries. She answered sheepishly, and you could tell she was just completely spent. I queried about the incident in the cottage, and she was literally at a loss. She remembered nothing. Yes, people can get blackout angry, but here's the thing. This child would go from 0 to 100 in the blink of an eye. There was no boiling point for Angel. Things were fine until they weren't. And unfortunately for us, we never knew when the volcano would erupt. I honestly didn't think Angel knew herself. I just know I personally witnessed a child that was normally very sweet absolutely explode out of nowhere for absolutely no reason at all. Then she'd immediately calm down and could not recall what happened or why it happened. She would be just as confused as the rest of us, and very apologetic. To quote Red from the Shawshank Redemption, "I do believe those first 2 years were the worst for him, and I also believe if things had gone that way, this place would have got the best of him." Except, in Angel's case, it was 2 months and he was a she. I personally tried a few different solutions to keep Angel calm. What ended up working out for the best at the time, I had a Papillon who loved to sing with me and it made for a really cute video. Angel really liked my pup, and I made her a promise. For every day she could go the entire day without acting out and getting a write-up, she'd get a brand new video made just for her of my pup and I singing. It was more my pup singing than me, and I'm sure she was grateful for that. Now, all of this prefaces the point I'm about to make. This girl adored my pupper. She loved the videos and they were always the highlight of her day. She'd have done anything to get to watch him, including not flipping out on staff and causing an incident, because we had a deal and she was aware of that. She acts out, no video for Angel that day. So she'd come over to the wellness department and I'd ask her if she'd been good that day. Kids being kids, they tend to lie to cover bad behavior. So I told her I'd be checking with the youth development supervisor, or YDS for the rest of this story, at her cottage to make sure she was honest with me. She always was truthful, probably because she knew I would check. Mostly she did really well. There were days when I'd ask if she'd been good, and she'd look at the floor and shake her head no. Her bottom lip would quiver and tears would well up in her eyes. She'd explain that she didn't know what happened and couldn't even remember what it was that she'd done wrong. I'd darn near cave in and show her the video anyway, but I simply couldn't do it. If I did, she could act with reckless abandon knowing she could see videos anytime she wanted to and didn't have to worry about her outbursts. Nope, that was not our deal. All this to say, I knew that child. This was a child that would have kept her behavior in check if it meant watching my pupper look at the ceiling and howl and sing with his little Papillon self. Now, those amongst you may say this was a child simply acting out, or a child with a mental illness, or both. Although I do feel both played a part in Angel's behavior, I know deep into my soul that there was something more than that. The inhuman strength, the Stygian eyes, the deep voice of a man who smokes 2 packs a day, the memory loss and that lack of recall, the minimal or non-existent triggers before a full-on raging, maniacal fit. If there were ever a case of demonic possession that I've witnessed with my own 2 eyes, Angel would be it. She literally ticks all the boxes off on the checklist. If you find this ending anticlimactic, dear reader or listener, Let me add one last detail that I never mentioned when introducing you to Angel. The reason she came to our facility to begin with. Angel was placed into our care at 8 years of age for attempted murder. You see, she had stabbed her grandmother in the stomach over and over. An 8-year-old little girl. Still think demonic possession isn't possible in today's world? My time working for an environmental cleanup crew. From Billy Towers. Let me start by saying that if you are squeamish, you should stop listening or reading now, because the story I'm going to tell you gets weirder and more vile by the minute. There, that was your warning. I had taken a job as an environmental cleanup crew member in the summer. My main tasks were cleaning up parks and the sides of highways for any trash that people felt they could leave anywhere. This did not pay well, but the important part was the volunteer hours for my college scholarship, and being part of a green group looks really good on a resume. Not to mention my major was in biology, so it made sense to get some practical experience. The first few weeks were kind of boring. We were cleaning up parks and abandoned buildings, and everywhere else people felt they could leave their trash. The most exciting things I'd find during a shift were maybe a used condom or some leftover drug paraphernalia. Nothing worth writing home about. There were some entertaining tales for the group chat, but that was it. Everything was going as well as it could until about my 5th week of work. I had arrived at work and waited for the vans that drive the crew members out to different locations, as usual. As expected, people began to come in, and the team leader stood in front of the group, ready to give out assignments. Only something was different. There was only one assignment. One of the leaders, a tall white man named Todd, explained that there was a small marsh that was so polluted with trash and refuse that even though it was isolated from major water sources, it still posed a major threat to nearby ecosystems, and even to people. Todd went on to explain that while more official organizations had done a majority of the cleaning, they still needed help from locals willing to step up and clear out what was left. I guess that was us. Now, normally, we were given some plastic gloves and a trash-grabbing claw. Not this time. This time, we were told to put on heavy overalls, made out of some kind of thick rubber, galoshes that went almost to our knees, and thick rubber gloves that didn't breathe. Even though we were in an air-conditioned building, I was sweating bullets. Then we had to get in the vans. The ride to the marsh felt like a sauna. I think I'd polished off 3 water bottles by the time we got there. And when I saw where we were going to be working, I almost threw all of that water up. In front of us was a wetland that stunk to high heaven. It was a mix of rotten meat and raw sewage that had been sitting in the sun since the sun came out. We all had to be given special respirator masks that we were told to keep on at all times. This made me wish I'd read my contract more carefully, because something here had to be illegal. Still, I put the mask on and took a deep breath of filtered air. After the masks, we were each handed a trash bag and a grabbing claw before Todd stood in front of the crew again and explained that we would be working in teams of 3 to be as safe as possible. Each team would be given an air horn, so if they did have any trouble, they could sound an alarm and get help as soon as possible. After a long lecture about being safe and not being a hero, we were given our teams, then sent into the muck. I was teamed up with a brown-skinned, stout man named Raoul and a blonde, thin girl named Crystal. We didn't know each other very well, but we all gave each other a sort of trust glance before walking in. The water went a little above our knees, but it was so dirty we couldn't see our legs beneath it. And the mud, or what I hoped was just mud, it was so thick, it felt like I sank a good 6 inches every time I put my foot down. The first hour or so went by uneventfully. It was really hard to talk over the masks on our faces, so any attempt at small talk simply came out as grunts, chuckles, or sighs. So we decided to have some fun with what we found in the marsh. I'd grabbed something soft and squishy with my trash claw and pulled it up to reveal a cute but absolutely filthy pink teddy bear. Crystal gave a sad sigh as I put the poor toy into the trash bag. As we continued through the quagmire, we heard our first air horn. Raoul, Crystal, and I turned around quickly to see a woman blasting the air horn and a man struggling to pull something out of the water. We rushed over to the other team as quickly as our mud-sunk boots would let us, and we went over to the man. Raoul went to one side of the man, and I went to the other, before reaching under the water. When I put my hands under, I felt what I immediately recognized as an arm. I pulled upward with all my strength, We slipped and slid in the sludge before finally pulling up a person with long hair from the sludge. With whatever strength we had left, the three of us hauled the person to shore and called for help. 2 hours later, paramedics showed up, and the person was brought to the hospital in an ambulance. I asked the other 2 team members what happened, and the woman simply said that sometimes, because of the silt, sinkholes form and can swallow people who aren't careful up in an instant. Todd told us that our first day at this marsh was over and that there would be new safety protocols in place. Against my better judgment, I did come back the next week. Something about this particular project had caught my attention, and I wanted to know exactly why. We were all given our gear and safety speech with one more caveat. We were given poles to poke for sinkholes. I was on a team with Raoul and Crystal again. We gave each other fist bumps before walking into the muck again. Raoul walked ahead of us with his sinkhole rod as Crystal and I trotted behind, picking up chip bags, soda cans, and anything else we could fit in the bags. As I was walking, I felt something hard near my boot. I thought it was a rock, so I tried to push it aside with my boot. The rock, however, did not like that, and I felt something latch onto my boot with extreme pressure. I screamed as loud as I could in my mask before I heard an air horn behind me. I turned to see Crystal holding the air horn high in the air. I turned back to Raoul, who was rushing toward me. He reached into the water and grabbed something. He pointed a finger up to the sky, which I took as a sign to lift my leg, so I did. Raoul lifted something that looked like a long, strange tube in his hand, and as his hand left the water, it revealed what had latched on to my boot. A very angry and hissing snapping turtle. Another man had come up behind me, lifting me slightly from my shoulders. Then he and Raoul pulled me to shore. With the help of some of the other crew members and eventually animal control, we got the snapping turtle to release my boot, and it was sent somewhere much safer. Todd came up to me and asked if I wanted to go home. I took a look at the small puncture mark on my boot, then looked at him with a smile, asking if he had any duct tape. With a pair of new boots, I stepped back into the muck with my team, and we continued our shift. I took the lead this time, hoping that the next snapping turtle I run into bites the rod in front of me, and not my foot. We continued our shift until we heard the announcement that indicated the end of the day. Raoul and I turned around to see that Crystal was gone. There was no way she had walked all the way back to shore, so she had to be underwater. We searched the water, reaching in and feeling around for any sign of her. A few feet behind us, we heard something emerge from the water. We turned to the sound to see what had risen from the sludge. It wasn't Crystal, but a decomposing body facing us. The body began to approach, and I saw Raoul sign a cross on his chest before we heard a screech as the body dropped back into the water. Behind where the corpse had been standing was Crystal, who hurriedly wiped her hands before reaching to her side and blasting the air horn. A few hours later, the police arrived and pulled the body from the water. They asked us all several questions before telling us that this is now an active crime scene and we would not be allowed back here anytime soon. Given what I'd already seen these past 2 weeks, I didn't think I'd be coming back to that job either. She Saved Me, from Rice Krispie. For some background, I'm from New England, and my grandpa and I share a love of nature, hiking, and photography. Actually, I think I got that from him. We always went up to New Hampshire, Vermont, and Maine in the fall for foliage photos and maple syrup. Once I was old enough, around 11 or 12, we started to do hikes. Shortly after that, in 2019, I moved away to Ohio, but I came back to visit during my winter and summer breaks. We took to hiking a new trail every time we visited, and the winter hikes were some of my favorite. Icicles make for some beautiful photos. Anyway, this story takes place during one of those winter hikes when I was around 12 or 13, somewhere in the White Mountains. I can't recall the trail name. My grandpa and I were on a moderate-level hiking trail, headed to a beautiful frozen waterfall in a ravine. The trail took us around a corner, and in front of us was the start of the ravine, as well as a group of hikers who were taking photos of the ravine, which was sparkling with snow and ice. We made small talk for a bit before they moved on, and we took their spot in front of the railing to take our own pictures. Something important to note about the railing was that it was the only thing separating the trail from the steep drop-off of at least 50 feet, but it had a gap of about 2 feet underneath it. Anyway, we were taking photos at this bend. I climbed onto a rock to get a better angle. As I was trying to slide carefully off this rock, with my hands behind me for stability and my legs out in front of me, both my hand and foot slipped on the ice. I started to slide like a greased bullet, and I was heading straight for the gap under the railing. There was a substantial and harrowing drop below. I did not have time to react, and neither did Grandpa, who was a few feet away taking pictures. Suddenly, with my feet hanging from the edge, an arm reached out and grabbed me around my waist. A woman in her late 20s, early 30s, had caught me, had saved me. She helped me back onto my feet, and my grandpa thanked the woman profusely. She explained that she was with the group of hikers from before, who were now 5 minutes or so down the trail. We took a break so I could catch my breath, and she continued down the trail and out of sight. I didn't think about her explanation at the time. I was just grateful. But as I recalled this event a few years later, I realized there were some oddities. We never saw her with the group when they stopped to take pictures, and we never saw her after the event. I also hadn't noticed her from atop my rock. She was suddenly just there, at the very right place, at the perfect time, to save me. I'm not sure how or why. Was she some sort of guardian angel, or if she just had incredibly fortuitous timing? But whatever it was, she's likely the reason I'm even able to write this today. Kids are supposed to be innocent, living a life of joy and happiness. Whenever I see stories or news about children having thoughts that even messed up adults never have, committing atrocities against themselves or others, I'm quickly reminded that we live in a dark, dark world, and I become both sad and afraid. Good night. Thank you so much for tuning in to this episode of Tales from the Break Room. I've been your host, Darkness Prevails. You can find me on Twitter at Dark Prevails, or I guess that's called X now, and on YouTube at Darkness Prevails, where I narrate more stories. Make sure you follow and listen to my other show, Unexplained Encounters, especially if you prefer allegedly true stories about ghosts, monsters, and other unexplained phenomena. That's Unexplained Encounters, and you can find it on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or your favorite podcast app. Till next time, everyone, I've got to clock out, but I'll be back again real soon. Folks these days fantasize about going off-grid, leaving it all behind and living alone in the wilderness, where you answer to nobody. It sounds like freedom. And for tonight's anonymous Cinder, a hunter and trapper living on 40 acres in remote Alaska, it was, for about 8 years. This story is called Becoming Hunted, and it's a deeply unsettling account of something that moved into this man's territory one fall. Something that he tracked, that he found, that one night came to his cabin and let itself in. If you live alone in the backcountry, keep your deadbolt locked, and whatever you do, don't follow the tracks past the creek. A buddy of mine told me about your show. He and I used to work the same fishing lodge before we went separate ways, but he's still one of 4 people who has my radio frequency. He called me about a week ago, and he told me to send my story in. But I told him I didn't really have a work story. I don't have a job in any way most people would recognize the word job. But he said to try anyway. So here I am, and I apologize in advance if this doesn't fit the mold. I realize the show is about work-related stories, and what I do is more of a situation than work. I live on 40 acres in the interior of Alaska, about 70 miles from town, by a road that is paved for roughly the first 30 of those miles, then transitions into a series of increasingly optimistic suggestions about where a vehicle might go. For 4 or 5 months of the year, the road is impassable due to snow or breakup, which is what we call the period in spring when the frozen ground turns into something with the consistency and reliability of pudding. I inherited the land from my uncle, who died in 2014. He left it to me because I was the only family member who ever visited him there, and I moved onto it full-time about 8 years back, after a stretch of life in Fairbanks that I don't particularly want to get into. I'll just say it ended, and I was glad it did. So let me explain the situation. I hunt and I trap for food. I'm able to sell some pelts, Marten, lynx, beaver when I can get them, and I pick up seasonal work when it's available. Like firewood cutting for the lodge that my aforementioned friend used to work at. Even equipment maintenance for a guy who runs a fly-in hunting operation. Between the pelts and the odd jobs, I can cover my property taxes, ammunition, fuel for the generator and the truck, the short list of things I can't grow, catch, or kill on my own. I'm not fully off-grid. I have electricity from the generator, a radio, a truck that works when the road does, and nowadays Starlink, which is miraculous, honestly. But I live alone by a margin that would probably seem excessive to most people. I've been doing it long enough, though, that the alone part is not a feature of my life anymore. It's just the foundation of it. I'm telling you all of this so you understand I know where I live, and I know what lives around me. I'm very familiar with the animal tracks in my area. I can identify species by track or sight. I can tell you from a scat pile what a bear ate 3 days ago, and roughly how big it was. I've had my up-close encounters too. I've had a grizzly in my yard, a moose on my porch in fact. One time a wolverine got into my storage shed and destroyed about 40 pounds of dried fish out of what I can only assume was personal malice. None of that ever scared me. Pissed me off, yeah, but never scared me. All of that is just Tuesday when you live out here. But what I'm about to describe to you is different. And it scared me badly enough that I haven't told anyone until now this experience that happened over 14 months ago. I run a meat cache about 200 yards north of my cabin, set back in the trees at the edge of a birch stand. If you're not familiar with the setup, a cache is basically a raised platform. Mine is built on 4 posts about 10 feet off the ground, with sheet metal wrapped around the posts, so animals can't climb up. You hang or store your meat up there, and the height and the metal keep the bears out, which is the entire point. Because if you're storing game meat in bear country and you don't cache it properly, you're gonna wake up one morning to a grizzly in your yard who has decided your food is his food. And that kind of confrontation ends badly for someone, regardless of how it plays out. My cache has worked for 8 years. I've had bears investigate it, I've found tracks around the base and claw marks on the posts, but nothing has ever gotten up the platform. The metal works and the height works. The system just works, which is why I was genuinely confused when I walked out one morning in late September and I found the crossbar snapped and the platform listing sideways, about 30 pounds of moose meat scattered on the ground. My first response was annoyance, because 30 pounds of moose represents roughly 2 days of hunting and butchering work. And the damage to the cache meant at least another day of repair before I could store anything else. I thought it was a grizzly that had gotten lucky or gotten big enough to just brute force my design, which can happen. A large enough bear can reach higher and pull harder than the cache was built to withstand. I gathered what was salvageable, which wasn't a lot. Most of it had been on the ground long enough to attract smaller scavengers. After that, I began to look at the tracks around the base. This is the part where things started to bother me, and I want to be precise about it. I'm aware of how this is going to sound as it goes on, and I'd rather you trust the early details so the later ones have something to stand on. The tracks around the cache were bear-like in their general characteristics. Large, 5-toed, with claw impressions forward of the toe pads. If I'd glanced at them while walking past, I would have said black bear, maybe a young grizzly, and I would keep going. But I wasn't glancing. I was crouching over them in good light on soft ground, which is about the best tracking conditions you can ask for. And what I was seeing in those conditions did not line up. The stride length was inconsistent. An animal walking at a steady pace leaves a regular pattern. The distance between its left front and left rear print stays roughly the same from one cycle to the next, because the animal's legs are a fixed length and its gait is a fixed rhythm. These prints varied by as much as 6 inches within the same trail over flat ground. The animal was not speeding up or slowing down. There was no change in the depth or angle of the impressions that might indicate a change in pace. It was just walking, and its stride was shifting as though its legs were changing length between steps, which is a sentence I'm aware makes no sense. I'm just telling you what was on the ground. The claw impressions were strange too. Some prints showed claws fully extended and dug deep into the soil. A bear's claws register the same way when it's pushing off for speed or gripping for a climb. The next print in the sequence would show the claws barely there, just faint arcs ahead of the toe pads, retracted or reduced. Bears don't do this. A bear's claws are actually fixed. They don't retract like a cat's, and their length doesn't vary from one step to the next. And the weight distribution. It shifted within the trail in a way I've never seen in any quadruped. The front prints would be deep and heavy, as though the animal was leaning forward on its forelimbs, carrying most of its mass on the front end. Then 4 or 5 steps later, the rear prints would be the deep ones, and the front ones would lighten up, like the animal had rocked its weight backward onto haunches without actually stopping or changing posture. I told myself it was an injured bear. A bear with a damaged leg or hip problem could produce an irregular stride, and pain could cause weight shifting. That was the best explanation I had, and I was motivated to accept it, because nothing else made sense. There's no way I was reading the tracks wrong, and I wasn't really prepared to think that the tracks were made by something that I didn't know. I followed the trail away from the cache because, regardless of what made it, I had to know where it was coming from and how close it was denning. If a bear is working your cache, you need to figure out if it's a transient passing through or a local that's going to come back every night, and the answer determines whether you scare it off or kill it. I'm not sentimental about bears. A bear that associates your camp with food is a bear that will eventually come through your door, and waiting for that to happen out of some kind of ecological kindness is a good way to die. The trail led north-northwest from the cache into the timber. Black spruce, mostly, with some birch mixed in along the creek drainage. The ground was soft from recent rain, and the tracks were clean and easy to follow. I moved through the trees with my .30-06 and my full attention, because whatever I was tracking was big, and I did not want to walk up on it from behind. About 1.5 miles from the cache, the trail entered a small natural clearing, maybe 60 feet across, where a few birches had come down in a windstorm the previous spring and opened up the canopy. I stopped at the edge of the clearing because I could see what was in it, and I needed a minute before I got closer. It was a moose calf, probably 2 days dead, based on the bloating and the condition of the exposed tissue. It had been killed and fed on, which in itself is not unusual. Bears kill moose calves regularly in the fall, and a calf kill looks more or less like what you'd expect from a large predator. One with torn hide, accessed body cavity, scattered remains, and a general mess. I've seen dozens of bear kills over my years. They can be ugly, but they do follow a pattern that I can understand. And yet this didn't follow a pattern. If you've got a weak stomach, I'm warning you now. The calf had been opened from sternum to pelvis along a line so clean, it looked like it had been done by a knife. The 2 flaps of hide and muscle on either side of the incision had been folded back onto the ground, spread flat, like how you'd place an open book face down to hold your place. The body cavity was empty, though. The organs, all of them as far as I could tell, were placed in a neat stack on the moss beside the carcass. They almost looked like they had been separated by type or arranged in size, roughly. Stomach and rumen first, followed by intestinal mass, then liver, kidneys, lungs, and heart, running largest to smallest from the calf's head toward its tail. They were evenly spaced. They were carefully oriented too, each organ placed with its long axis perpendicular to the line of the row. They had been put there with care, by something that had a concept of organization and the dexterity to execute it. I stood at the edge, just looking at this mess. I've butchered my game for 8 years, and I have a pretty thorough working knowledge of ungulate anatomy, and I'm telling you that what I was looking at was closer to a field dissection than a predator kill. Bears obviously don't arrange stuff like that. They're indifferent to anything but feeding, and feeding to a bear is a demolition event. They go in wherever they can get a grip, and they pull when something gives, and they eat what comes loose. They leave the rest in whatever state it lands in. But what happened to that moose calf required some degree of manual precision and a conceptual framework of sorting. No normal animal did this. And now I was thinking it had to be a person. But if that's the case, what did these tracks belong to? I made myself walk through the clearing, picking up the trail on the far side. The alternative was standing there cycling through explanations that didn't work, and that wasn't going to help me figure out what was in my territory. The tracks led north through heavier spruce, climbing slightly as the terrain rose toward a low ridge that separates my drainage from the next one over. I followed them with my rifle up and my head on a swivel, checking sightlines. I was stepping lightly, because there was something bigger than me in this area. Something that wasn't human and wasn't a bear. About a half-mile past the kill site, I stopped walking. The tracks had changed. Where there had been 4 sets of prints, 2 front, 2 rear, in the alternating pattern of a 4-legged animal, there were now 2. The front prints had disappeared. The rear prints had shifted inward, moving closer together, deepening significantly, taking on the weight that had previously been distributed across 4 limbs. The stride got longer. The gait was no longer the rolling, slightly pigeon-toed walk of a quadruped. It was now bipedal, 2 feet, alternating heel to toe, in a straight line through the spruce. I crouched beside the transition point and studied it. I measured the stride with my outstretched hand, roughly 30 inches, consistent, even. I looked at the depth and the angle of the impressions. I looked at how the toe area of each print bore the most weight, with the heel registering lighter. The signature of a creature walking upright with its weight centered and balanced, not some animal rearing up on its hind legs and lurching forward off balance. I told myself a bear had stood up. Bears do this, I think we've all seen the videos. They stand on their hind legs to look over brush or to get their nose above the ground level scent layer, and sometimes they shuffle forward a few steps while upright, before dropping back down. What I had never seen before, though, was a bear maintaining a consistent bipedal stride for what I paced out to be roughly 40 yards through timber, walking between trees, navigating roots and uneven ground. The gait was so smooth and regular that the spacing between prints barely varied by an inch over the entire stretch. Whatever walked upright through those spruce trees was not shuffling. It wasn't struggling to maintain balance either. This thing was walking the way I walk, easy, fluent, with a body clearly designed for exactly that posture. After 40 yards, the tracks spread again. The front prints reappeared, the rear prints lightened, and the animal was back to 4 legs, moving north at a steady pace as though nothing had changed. I stood at the endpoint of the bipedal section, looking back along the line of tracks. I could feel something shifting in the back of my mind, some load-bearing piece of my understanding of what lives in these woods, adjusting itself under a weight that it was not ready for. I followed the trail for another quarter mile, but I lost it on a rocky shelf where a creek cuts through the ridge. The ground went to cobble and gravel and the tracks disappeared, and I spent the next 20 minutes working both banks, looking for where the trail picked up again. I couldn't find it. Whatever I was following had either gone up the creek on the rocks, or had crossed and continued on ground hard enough not to make an impression, and either way I was done for the day. A bit confused, I went home. I ate some dinner and cleaned my rifle, which didn't even need cleaning, but it helps to calm me down. I went to bed, and I didn't sleep terribly well. In the morning I went back out. Whatever was in my territory was probably still there, and I needed to know what I was up against. I want to be clear about something before I keep going. I'm not a guy who sees things in the woods. Again, I've been out here for 8 years, alone, and I've never once scared myself. I don't hear voices, I don't see shapes that aren't there. I don't tell stories around fires, because 1, there's no one to tell them to, and 2, I wouldn't tell them if there were. What I've described so far is what was on the ground in front of me, in soft soil, in good light, as legible and unambiguous as print on a page. I know what I saw and how to read a track as well as anyone in this part of the state. And what I read in those tracks was something that walks on 4 legs when it wants to, and 2 legs when it wants to, but can open up a moose calf like a textbook and arrange its organs by size in some neat little line. And I didn't have a name for it. Even now, I have no idea what to call it. I just knew it was out there, somewhere past the creek, in the drainage north of my cabin. And whatever it was, it knew where my food was. The next morning I crossed the creek, where I'd lost the trail. I worked the far bank for about an hour, moving upstream and downstream in widening arcs, looking for where the tracks might pick up again. The ground over there is harder, more rock, less topsoil. Not a place where you'd find impressions or prints unless conditions are perfect. I found a partial print though, on a muddy patch about 40 yards past the creek, heading north-northwest, consistent with the direction the trail had been going before I lost it. It was enough, so I kept moving. The country past the creek is land I know well, or I thought I did. I've hunted this area for the better part of 8 years. I was familiar with where the game trails cross, where the blueberry patches are, which south-facing slopes the moose like to bed on in the early fall when the bugs die off. Even now I could draw you a map of the major features from memory. Just in August I'd walked through this exact area picking blueberries, which is an activity that takes you over the ground slowly and thoroughly. That will help you understand what I mean when I say that the cabin I found 1.5 miles past the creek was not there 8 weeks ago. It was back in this small clearing in a stand of spruce. A great spot if you wanted to be invisible from any distance greater than about 50 yards. It was a log construction, roughly but solidly built. It had a stovepipe chimney with smoke coming out of it, a woodpile along the south-facing wall stacked neatly, at least 2 cords, a game rack beside the front door, just a crossbar between 2 posts with what looked like hides hanging from it, though from the tree line I couldn't tell what kind. The setup looked well established, like it had been there for several seasons. The logs were even weathered to a gray that takes years to develop. The woodpile had the compacted, settled look of wood that's been stacked and restacked over multiple cycles. A person glancing at this place would have guessed it was 5 or 10 years old, minimum. Like I said, I'd been standing in this clearing 8 weeks prior. I picked berries within 30 feet of where that cabin sat. There was no cabin. There was no clearing, for that matter. I stood at the edge of the clearing with my .30-06 across my chest. I looked at the cabin, and I tried to construct some scenario in which it could have been built in 8 weeks by one guy with no road access and no equipment. But I couldn't do it. That's nonsense. I'm no expert in log construction, but I've had enough experience with manual labor in the wilds to know what I was looking at represented months of work at minimum. But you know what else I saw? Those tracks, the ones I'd been following, they led right to the front door. I walked right up. That's what I was here for. Yeah, I know that probably sounds like the worst idea, even insane, after everything I just told you about the tracks, the moose calf, the bipedal stretch, and the suddenly appearing cabin. I get that, but the social mechanics of the backcountry are simple and deeply ingrained. And one of the primary rules is that you don't skulk about someone else's property with a gun. You walk up, you announce yourself, and you behave like a neighbor. You don't want to be mistaken for a threat out here, because that's how you get shot at. But also, I had to know what was making those tracks. But whatever I was thinking about those tracks, the cabin had smoke coming out of the chimney. Smoke means a person, and a person means you go say hello to them. I slung my rifle over my shoulder, and I walked across the clearing. I knocked on the door. The man who opened it was tall. I'm about 6 foot. I had to look up at him, which puts him at maybe 6'3" or 6'4". He had broad shoulders and a broad chest, and he wore a flannel shirt, green and black, with canvas work pants and boots. He was smiling before the door was all the way open. I didn't expect such a quick smile. That smile was already on his face before the door swung open, fully formed, as though he'd assembled it on the other side, then opened the door to present it. I want to say that people don't usually smile like that. When you open your door to an unexpected knock in the Alaskan bush, you're faced as a series of things in rapid sequence. Surprise, assessment, recognition, or non-recognition, then the appropriate social expression, which might be a smile, or it might be wariness, depending on what or who you see. This man's face skipped all that. The smile was just there, wide and warm and fixed. It stayed at the same intensity for the duration of our conversation, and it never once reached his eyes, his gray or light blue eyes, which watched me with an attention that had nothing to do with friendliness. I introduced myself. I told him my name, saying I lived a few miles south, and that I'd been tracking what I thought was a bear that had gotten into my cache. I asked if he'd seen anything. This was standard Alaskan bush conversation. You lead with the practical reason for your visit, and the personal stuff comes later or never at all. He said yes, he'd seen a bear. His voice was fine, deep, unhurried, a normal man's voice with no particular accent that I could place. He said it had been around at night, and he'd heard it outside his cabin after dark. Then he said something that I'm going to relay verbatim, because ever since I've not been able to stop thinking about it. He said, "It comes closer than you'd think, right up to your door sometimes." Then that smile widened by a quarter inch, which should not have been possible, given it was already at full extension, and I felt the skin on the back of my neck prickle, like there was a threat right in front of me. We talked for another minute or two. He stood in the doorway and I stood on the packed earth in front of the cabin, and he didn't invite me inside, but I didn't ask to come in. During those 2 minutes I was cataloging things, not deliberately though. I wasn't in some investigative mindset, I was just looking around, and here's what I noticed. The guy was sweating. It was early October by this point, and the temperature was about 35 degrees, cold enough that my breath was visible, and I was wearing 2 layers under my jacket. This man was in a flannel shirt with the sleeves rolled to his elbows, yet there were beads of sweat on his forehead, his upper lip, the hollow of his throat where the shirt was unbuttoned. His shirt was darkened at the collar and under the arms. He was not exerting himself. He'd answered the door from a seated position. I could see a chair by the stove through the doorway, and he was standing still while he talked. He was producing the sweat of a man doing hard labor on a summer afternoon, but it was 35 degrees, and he was just standing still in the doorway. His hands were kept behind the door frame for most of the conversation, resting on the back of the door or hanging at his sides, just out of my line of sight. But he did gesture once, a quick offhand wave indicating a direction, and I saw his right hand clearly for about 2 seconds before he pulled it back. It was a large hand. That was an understatement. His hand was disproportionately large for his frame, which was already a big frame, and the fingers were thick and long. The knuckles were pronounced and darkened, with something that could have been grime or discoloration of the skin itself. The nails were either very long or very thick, maybe both. I couldn't tell because the hand was withdrawn before I got a better look, and the withdrawal was smooth and casual, and it could have easily been coincidental, but it wasn't. The doorframe itself had marks on it, vertical grooves scored into the wood at roughly the height of the man's shoulder, deep enough to show raw wood underneath the weathered gray, evenly spaced lines running about 18 inches from top to bottom. They could have been made by some tool. They weren't made by a tool though. You see, tools leave flat-bottomed grooves, and these were concave, round at the base, the shape you get when something curved and hard like a claw, for instance, if I'm being direct with you, is dragged through wood with enough force to cut past the grain. There was a smell coming from inside the cabin that the wood smoke almost covered, but not quite. It had this warm and meaty quality to it, raw meat. I've butchered hundreds of animals, and I know what a space smells like when something has been killed and processed in it, and the inside of that cabin smelled like a killing floor. Underneath the wood smoke and meaty smell was something else. Musky, sweaty, smelled like I was downwind of a bear den in spring, but sharper, less diffuse, as though the source was nearby and concentrated. There was something on the counter inside, just barely visible past the man's left shoulder. It was dark and wet-looking, laid out on what might have been a cutting board or just the bare wood of the counter surface. It was too big to be a rabbit or a grouse, and much too dark, almost black, with a sheen to it that suggested moisture. It could have been a section of moose or caribou. but the shape was not right for any cut of game I could identify, and as I shifted my weight slightly to get a better angle, the man moved with me, keeping his shoulder between my eyes and whatever was on that counter. He did this quickly, and smoothly too, without breaking the conversation. I let him, because by that point, every part of my body was screaming at me to leave. I told him I appreciated the information about the bear. He told me to be careful out there. The smile remained. I turned and walked across the clearing toward the tree line with my rifle on my shoulder, my back to him. And God, walking away from that cabin was one of the harder things I've done in my life. It was like my every ancestor that ever existed was floating behind me, screaming to run. And the reason I didn't, I can't be certain about. It was something I can't fully explain. That running would reveal something about me, or maybe about him. For now, we were just two neighbors having a conversation. That's all, on the surface. And as long as the surface held, I was safe. But if I ran, that surface would break, and I did not want to find out what was underneath it. He watched me go. I could feel it the whole way across the clearing, and into the trees, and for a good quarter-mile after that. This focused, patient attention on my back that did not go away with distance. I kept my pace steady, and I did not look back. I breathed through my nose, and I counted my steps, because that took my mind off of things. Things like that man's hands and his smile, and whatever that dark shape on the counter was. I got home, locked my door, which is something I almost never do during the day, and I sat down at my table with the rifle against the wall within arm's reach, and I ran through explanation after explanation. That man was a squatter. People build in the bush without permits sometimes. They don't tell anyone. Some of these folks have no contact at all with the outside world. Alaska has more than its share of people who have opted out of society, and not all of them are stable. Some loner living in an unregistered cabin in the backcountry is unusual, but not unheard of. His sweating could be a medical condition, anxiety. He could have been stoking the fire. And he could have just had big hands. The smell could have just been game processing. A recent moose or caribou he got. That bloody smell can linger. Taken together, all of these things fall apart. The thing that made them fall apart was everything I'd tracked over the previous 2 days. Something with retractable claws and inconsistent stride that had dissected a moose calf and arranged its organs seemingly for fun. Something that led tracks all the way to his front door. I thought about contacting someone about this. The logistics stopped me. My radio can reach the fishing lodge 30 miles south, and from there a message could get to the trooper post in town. But what was there to report so far? That my neighbor has big hands? I could hear the conversation in my head, and it sounded like every other bush hermit call-in that the troopers have to deal with. Vague, paranoid, unprovable nonsense. I had no evidence of a crime. No evidence of anything, really. So I had to do what I could. I decided to stay out of the drainage north of the creek. I would hunt south and east, in country I knew, away from the ridge and away from that cabin. The season was getting short. The first hard freeze could come any week, and once the ground locked up and the snow came, the hunting would shift to a different rhythm. I needed maybe 2 more good days to fill the cache enough to get me through, and I could do that without going anywhere near the north drainage. I know how this sounds to your listeners. I know some of you are thinking I should have left and just driven back to town with a packed bag. I considered that. Honestly, I did. But this is my home. The only place I have. The only life that works for me. Leaving it because I'm scared. Because some anomalous tracks and a neighbor who made me uncomfortable. That would mean giving up everything I've built over nearly a decade. And I was not willing to do that. Not yet. Because at the time I could still file everything under strange but survivable. I stayed then. I hunted south and east. I repaired my cache and reinforced the posts. I kept my rifle close at all times and the door locked, and I stayed out of the north drainage. For 3 days, that arrangement was fine. But on the 4th night, it wasn't. During those 3 days, I found a boot print on the trail to my outhouse. It was in a patch of mud that I step over every time I use that trail. You see, I personally do not like muddying my boots. This wasn't my boot print. Someone or something had stepped directly in the center of it, and the print was certainly a boot, a lug-soled boot larger than mine, pressed in real deep. I wear a size 11, but this was bigger. I stood there and looked at it. Then I went to the outhouse and came back, and I looked again. After that, I went inside and locked my door. That same afternoon, I checked my cache and found a mark on one of the support posts. It was about 7 feet up, above the sheet metal. I found the same types of gouges that had been on that man's doorframe, but these were deep and fresh, cut through to the pale interior of the post. The sheet metal below the gouges was unmarked, which meant whatever had made them had reached past the metal from above, had reached up and over the barrier that was specifically designed to prevent reaching, and scored the post at a height that would require something with an arm span I did not want to think about. On the third evening, just before dark, I was bringing firewood in from the pile beside the cabin, and I smelled it. That same bloody smell, carried on the breeze from the north, faint and gone almost before I caught it. I dropped the wood inside and closed my door. I locked my deadbolt, and I sat in my chair with the rifle across my lap. I stayed put until I finally fell asleep sometime after midnight. On the fourth night, I went to bed early. Darkness comes around 6 in October here. My generator fuel is not unlimited. There's only so long you can sit in a 12 by 20 cabin with a kerosene lamp with your own thoughts before the thoughts start to win. I ate, I banked the stove, and I put the lamp out. The rifle was leaning against the wall on the left side of the bed frame, where I always kept it, loaded, safety on. I was asleep by 8. I'm not sure what time it was when the door handle woke me. I didn't check. What I know is that it was fully dark, and the stove had nearly burned out, which meant at least a few hours had passed, and the sound that pulled me out of my sleep was the sound of my thumb latch on the front door being depressed, slowly. The mechanical click of the latch bar lifting out of the strike plate was distinct in that silence, a small and precise sound that I have heard 10,000 times, that my sleeping brain identified instantly as wrong. You see, I'm the only occupant, and I was in bed. So me being in bed and that latch moving were two things that could not be true at the same time, unless something was wrong. The latch made it to the top of its travel and held there. Pressure on the door. The deadbolt caught it. I could hear the door flex in its frame, not from a shove or a slam, but the steady inward pressure. Someone testing the limits of what the bolt could do. That pressure held for maybe 5 seconds. Then the latch lowered, gently, and the pressure released. The door settled back into the frame, and there was silence. I was on my back in bed, my eyes open and my hands already moving toward the rifle. I got my fingers around the stock and pulled it across my body, thumbing the safety off, lying there with a steadily increasing heart rate. Then I listened. Silence. Long enough that I started to wonder if I was just dreaming. Maybe I'd dreamt the sound. Maybe I was still dreaming. But I knew deep down it was my brain offering some courtesy, better than accepting the unacceptable. After 30 seconds to a minute, something happened. The window in the main room is a double-pane unit to the right of the front door, about 2 feet by 3 feet, and I heard a sound coming from it, a creak of pressure against glass, the frame flexing as something leaned into it from outside, testing the give. Whatever was doing it was careful and methodical. The pressure increased slowly until the frame groaned, then it stopped, and the pressure released, and there was silence again. I need you to understand what was happening here, because I think it's part of this story that I have the most difficulty with, even more than what came later. Whenever a bear wants to get into a structure, It pushes until the structure gives. It does not try the door handle, not on purpose. It doesn't test a window for flex, then back off and reconsider. What was outside my cabin that night was engaging in sequential problem solving. It tried one entry point, found it secured, and moved to the next one. And it was doing it patiently and quietly. It was not frustrated by failures. It was simply working through its options to get inside. I climbed out of bed. I didn't turn on a single light. I did not want it to know I was awake or what room I was in. In the dark, I at least had the advantage of knowing my own cabin by feel. I moved to the back corner of the main room, the corner diagonal from the front door, where I could put my back against the log wall and see the door and the window and the open doorway to the side room. The side room is where I keep my food stores, my tools, and miscellaneous equipment. It's about 8 by 10 feet, unheated, with a plywood floor that I laid over the joists when I first moved in. I stood in my corner, with the rifle up, and I waited. It circled the cabin. I tracked it by the sound of the logs creaking under pressure as something heavy leaned against the exterior wall and moved along it. It paused at the back window. There was a smaller pane of glass there, about 18 inches square, which I almost never opened. I heard that pressure on the glass again. The frame flexed, it released, and moved on. I then heard it pause at the stovepipe vent. It's a round metal collar that passes through the wall behind the stove. There was a faint metallic scraping as something touched or tested the pipe from outside. Then it moved past, and the creaking continued along the far wall, then stopped. I lost track of it, and that was disturbing. When it was moving, I could follow it, keep it located in my mental map. I would know how far it was from each potential entry point, where it currently was. But when it stopped, I had nothing to go on. It could be standing still against the wall 6 feet from me, separated by 4 inches of log, or it could have backed off into the tree line. Maybe it was doing something that I had not anticipated, and the silence offered no information. I stood in my corner with the rifle against my shoulder, and my finger along the trigger guard. I tried to control my breathing, which was fast and shallow and loud enough in the quiet cabin that I was sure whatever was outside could hear it. That quietness lasted for what I think was about 5 minutes, though time in that kind of darkness and that kind of fear loses its mechanical properties and becomes something softer, less reliable. 5 minutes or 10 minutes or 20? I don't know. What I know is that the next sound I heard did not come from outside the cabin. It came from underneath it. My cabin sits on posts. It's raised about 18 inches off the ground. Standard construction for permafrost country, where you don't want the heat from your floor melting the ground beneath the building and destabilizing the foundation. The gap between the ground and the floor joists is skirted with sheets of plywood that I nailed up in my first year to keep animals from dinning under the structure. The plywood was old though, and I had not yet replaced it, and I knew, even as I heard the first crack, that it was not going to hold anything that wanted through it. The sound was a splintering, flexing crack from the south side of the cabin, a sheet of plywood being pushed inward by something that was pressing against it from outside. And then the looser sound of the board giving way and falling flat. Then something was under my cabin, under my floor, and I could hear it moving beneath me. Something heavy. The scrape and drag of a large body pulling itself through an 18-inch gap between frozen ground and floor joists. The joists above it creaked as its back or shoulders pressed up against the underside of my floor, and the sound traveled from the south wall toward the north wall, toward the side room, and I stood in the main room, tracking it with my rifle barrel pointed at the floor, as though I could shoot through it, which I probably could, but I wouldn't. A 30-06 round through my own floor into a dark crawl space at an unknown target was not a shot I was going to take. It reached the side room. I heard it directly under the plywood floor in there, and I heard the boards react. The loose ones. The ones I'd been meaning to fix since spring, because the moisture had warped them and they didn't sit flush anymore. A board lifted. I heard the wooden clap of it tilting on the joist and dropping back, then another, further into the room, then a third, and this one didn't drop back. It was pushed up and aside with a scraping sound. Cold air came through the gap, and that musky smell came with it. Thick and immediate, so strong it was almost a physical presence. That same animal and bloody stench from the man's cabin, but concentrated now, enclosed, filling the small space of my home. Something came up through the floor of the side room. I could hear it. The creak of the joists taking weight in a way they weren't designed to take. The scrape of the plywood boards being displaced. The heavy, effortful sound of a large body hauling itself through an opening that was barely big enough to accommodate it. And now, it was inside. I could hear it breathing in the side room, about 12 feet away from me through an open doorway in the dark, and the breathing was so deep and low, a sort of bellows sound that was too loud and too slow to be human, with a rasp on each exhale that made my chest hurt. It moved. Things fell off shelves, cans, I think, from the sound, and something heavier that hit the plywood with a thud. It was navigating the room, with a strange combination of power and caution, bumping against things then adjusting, and I could hear its feet on the plywood. They did not sound like paws or boots, but something with a heavy tread and a clicking undertone that could have been claws on wood, or maybe something else, but I didn't have a comparison for that. A glass jar then fell and broke, and the thing paused at the sound, and its breathing changed, becoming faster, shorter. Then it made a sound that I'm going to do my best to describe, even though I know I will fail. It came from low in the chest or the throat, a huffing sound, almost a cough. But underneath it, there was something tonal, something that rose and fell in a way that was closer to a voice than an animal sound, like a man trying to speak through a mouth that was not shaped for speech, or some intelligent animal actually trying to mimic the sound of a human. It wasn't a growl, and it wasn't a word, but something else entirely. Then, the shape filled the doorway. I saw it in silhouette, in the marginally less dark rectangle of the side room. And when I say marginally, I mean the difference between absolute black and something one shade above it. The side room has no window. What little I could see was defined by the faintest ambient glow from the coals in the stove reflecting off surfaces in the main room, and it was enough to give me an outline. And an outline was far too much for my brain. The thing was bent, compressed into a shape that fit under the 7-foot ceiling, but that clearly did not belong under a 7-foot ceiling. The mass of it was enormous, filling the doorframe side to side, and the posture was hunched, folded, a body that was too big for the space, and it was making continuous structural compromises to fit inside. The head was forward, extended on a neck that angled out from the shoulders at something close to 45 degrees, and the head itself was all screwed up, and thankfully the darkness then prevented me from fully appreciating what was there. I could tell, though, it had a long and heavy jaw, with a brow ridge that I could see as a horizontal shadow above the eyeline. The shoulders behind the head were the widest part, absurdly broad, and from the shoulders, the arms, or maybe the front legs, hung down well past the midpoint of the body, long enough that if it had straightened them, they would have reached the floor, even while it stood semi-upright. And the hands at the end of those arms were similar to the hands I'd seen in the doorway of the man's cabin, except they were even larger now. Or maybe I was just closer. And the fingers were curled inward, showing me exactly how long the nails were. But they were not nails. These were claws. It stood in the doorway, and I stood in my corner. We were 12 feet apart in the dark. I could hear that breathing and smell that bloody smell throughout my cabin like some sort of horrific gas leak. It knew I was there. I knew it did, since the first sound at the door handle. But I understood that with full clarity now, standing in that corner with my back to the wall and the rifle up. It had tested the door because it knew I was behind it. It had tested the windows because it was looking for a way to reach me. It went under the cabin, coming through the floor, and here it was now in my home in the dark, looking right at me. It took a step into the main room, The floor groaned and I felt the vibration through my boots. Its breathing shifted faster, making that noise again, and underneath it was a different sound, the rapid clicking from its mouth or jaw, almost insect-like, as if the teeth were working against each other, or the jaw hinge was opening and closing in quick succession. The sound was eager, and that made my blood freeze. My vision narrowed, and my hands went steady somehow. I think it was adrenaline, calming my nerves as I aimed the rifle towards it. I was going to fire. There was nothing else to do. If I didn't fire now, I would simply be killed, and I would not be here to tell this story. The last thing I wanted was to be in reach of those hand-like claws. I fired. A 30-06 in an enclosed log cabin is not a sound, it's more of a concussive event. The muzzle flash blew the darkness apart for a fraction of a second. A white-yellow blast of light lit the entire room in a single freeze frame. In that frame, and in that moment, we saw each other, and that image was burned into my head permanently. I cannot describe the rest of it. What I've already given you was the limits of my description. Everything else in my mind will stay with me, because I have no other choice. The dark came back in an instant. That thing screamed, and it was so human. A scream, full-throated and agonizing. There was surprise in it, a raw sound, so close to the sound of a grown man in pain, that my first instinct in the ringing aftermath of the gunshot was not relief, but guilt. I felt guilty for defending myself, as though I'd made a terrible mistake, like I'd shot a neighbor. It went through the wall, not the door or the window, the wall beside the doorway to the side room. An explosion of splintered log and insulation and cold air flooded in, and I heard it land on the frozen ground outside, and it moved, crashing through thick woods, heading north, heading toward the creek and the ridge, and probably that man's cabin. It took about 15 seconds before the sound of it moving faded to nothing. There was still a ringing in my ears, and a terrible cold pouring in through that hole in my wall. And that smell, it remained, now mixed with gunpowder. The silence of the woods at night after something so loud had happened, it was so bizarre, but relieving. Suddenly my legs buckled underneath me, and I fell down. I was suddenly on the floor with my back against the wall and my rifle across my knees. My hands, which were calm only seconds ago, were now shaking so hard I couldn't make them stop. I sat there until the sky started to lighten through the hole in my wall. It must have been about 5 hours. That whole 5 hours I did not move, and I did not sleep. I listened to the silence with an intensity that I think cost me something that I have yet to get back. At dawn, I got up. I walked to the side room and I looked at the floor. 2 boards were displaced, pushed up from below and shoved aside. The gap between them was maybe 2 feet wide and 18 inches across, barely enough for a man to fit through, and yet that thing had done it. There was blood on the edges of the boards, blood on the floor of the side room and on the wall where it went through. Dark and thick, darker than a man's blood. And the trail continued outside, through the shattered section of wall, across the yard and into the trees. I followed it for about 100 yards. I needed to know. The trail started at the cabin wall with boot prints, human boot prints in the churned-up mud and frost, a lug-soled boot larger than mine, pressing deep under a weight that was running. Over the next 30 yards, the prints changed. The stride went longer, and the shape narrowed, lengthening, the toe impressions deepening and spreading as the heel receded, and by the time the blood trail thinned and disappeared into the brush, the prints on the ground were no longer boots, and they were not human feet. There was something in between everything I'd seen so far, and they led north toward the creek. I did not follow them further. I patched the wall with plywood and 2x4s. I screwed the crawlspace skirting down with structural screws instead of nails, and I added a second layer. I reset the floorboards in the side room, bolting a sheet of plywood over them. I drove to town on a road that was already half frozen, buying ammunition and plywood, and I didn't tell a soul about what happened. I bought a new deadbolt, and a padlock for the crawlspace access, and 80 rounds of 30-06. I drove home and installed everything. And I'm still here. I went back to the man's clearing 6 weeks after that, after the first real freeze. I took my rifle and I crossed the creek. I walked to the exact spot where the cabin had stood. There was nothing there. No foundations or log ends, no ash from a stove, no depression in the ground where a structure had sat. Only spruce and moss and quiet. If I hadn't stood in front of that cabin, knocking on the door and looking at the man's smile, smelling blood on the air, I would have said nothing, and no one had ever been there. What a disturbing story. All the more reason to stay far away from Alaska. Let the modern pioneers handle it. What do you think it was, though? A desperate bear? Or something like a bear man? Even a werewolf? Let me know. Good night. Thanks for tuning in to this episode of Tales from the Break Room. If you're not listening on the podcast side, you're actually not getting a bonus story that I've narrated. So if you're on YouTube, head over to Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or your favorite podcast app. Search for and follow Tales from the Break Room, and you'll be getting a bonus story for this episode. Till next time, everyone, I'll be clocking out. Don't worry, I'll be back again real soon. There's a house on a lake in rural Wisconsin that's been sold 3 times in 10 years. Every time, the price drops. Every time, it's a young couple. And every time, it's the wife who starts having trouble sleeping. This story is called The House on Heron Lake. It was posted by Miss Snoot, a woman who lived in that house for 8 months. She made it out, but the woman before her didn't. If you find yourself scrolling real estate listings, and you find a lakeside home at a price that seems too good to be true, it is. Close the tab. For this story, I'm not going to use our real names, or the real name of the lake we were on. I'm a copywriter by trade, which means I spend all day making things sound polished and appealing, and I want to be upfront that I'm not doing that here. I'm not crafting this. I'm just telling you what happened to us between May and January at a house on a lake in rural Wisconsin, and I'm telling you because I don't know what else to do with it, and because someone just moved into that house. So they don't know what's in the water. My husband, Ethan, and I got married in April of the previous year. At the time, we were 28 and 29 years old, and we'd been dating since college. The wedding was small and perfect, and we were happy, just young and in love. We'd been living in a 1-bedroom in Milwaukee that cost more than it should have, so after the wedding, we started to look for something outside the city. Ethan had taken a job doing IT support for a company in a small town, about an hour northwest, and we had been talking for months about escaping from the city. Getting some space, a place where I could work from home without hearing my neighbor's TV through the wall, and somewhere Ethan could fish on weekends without having to drive for 2 hours just to find water. The house showed up on a listing site in early May. A 3-bedroom on a lake with a dock, a big porch that faced the water. And the price was so far below what we'd budgeted that I actually triple-checked whether the listing was a scam. It wasn't. It was a real house. The price was real too. Our realtor said the previous owners had relocated and were motivated to sell. I asked why they'd left. She said they'd moved out of state for work, and that answer was good enough for me. I didn't push it. I wasn't going to be picky about this situation. The house had a porch and a dock and a lake view, and it cost less than our current rent. Oh, you better believe I wanted it badly enough to not ask any questions. I didn't want to complicate it. We moved into the place in May, and for 4 months, it was everything we'd hoped it to be. But what happened there, we never saw coming. The house was beautiful and the lake was gorgeous. Our life there was the happiest we'd ever been. The lake was the thing we loved the most. Mid-sized, you could see the far shore, maybe a 1/4 mile across, ringed by trees and a handful of other houses spread wide apart. The water was spring-fed and clear in the shallows. You could see the sandy bottom for the first 15 feet, or 20 feet even, before it dropped off into the deeper green, then into a dark that you couldn't see through. I swam in it almost every day that summer. Ethan fished off the dock in the evenings. We had a bottle of wine on the porch most nights and watched the sun go down over the water. Meanwhile, our cats would sit in the windows, watching the lake like it was their very own personal nature documentary. The cats were named Poppy and Noodle. Poppy was a calico we'd adopted from a shelter during college, nervous and skittish and deeply opinionated about everything. Noodle was a big orange tabby who was afraid of nothing and had once fallen asleep on top of a running vacuum cleaner. I loved them both, but Poppy was my cat, the one who slept on my chest and followed me from room to room, purring so loudly you could hear her through a closed door. We met the neighbor across the lake about a week after we moved in. His name was Dearth. I'm sorry if I'm not spelling that right, I've never heard a name like it. But he was in his 70s, and he had lived on the lake for most of his life. He came over with a jar of homemade pickles. Dearth was friendly, though a bit stoic. I noticed a lot of older rural men in Wisconsin are that way. He would talk to us about weather and fishing, but he always avoided anything personal, unless you fought him on it. He told us about the lake. He was the one that taught us it was spring-fed and very deep in the center. He said there were spots where the bottom dropped to 80 or 90 feet, allegedly, though nobody had ever measured it properly. And he said it never fully froze in the winter. Something about the springs keeping the water circulating. He said something along the lines of, "Gets a shelf of ice around the edges, but the middle stays open, black water all winter." He said it matter-of-factly. I noticed that in the weeks since we'd moved in, I'd never seen Dearth on his dock. In fact, I never saw him near the water at all. The lake was beautiful during the day, but as time went on, it became more difficult to look at after dark. I don't mean spooky, but it was like the water after sunset went flat and black, and it wasn't so easy on the eyes. At those times, there wasn't much reflection or movement. The texture was just gone. It looked less like water, and more like a void, like a big dark hole in the landscape in the shape of a lake, and what was underneath became nothing at all. I made this observation out loud to Ethan once. He said I was being overdramatic. I laughed and agreed, because it did sound silly, at least for now. I swam in the lake for the first time on our third day in the house. It was warm enough that the air had a haze to it, but the water was still holding on to spring. Ethan was on the porch with a box of kitchen stuff he'd been unpacking for an hour, without making visible progress. I walked down to the dock in my swimsuit, and stood at the end looking down at the water, which was clear enough that I could see the sandy bottom 8 feet below. There were pebbles, and the shadow of the dock posts, and a single bluegill hanging motionless in the shade. "You're stalling," Ethan called from the porch. "I'm preparing." "You've been preparing for 3 minutes, just get in." So I jumped in. The cold hit me like a truck. I swear my whole body seized for a moment. I came up gasping, and I heard Ethan laughing. I splashed some water in his general direction, which fell about 40 feet short, and he raised a coffee mug he was holding in a toast. I then swam out about 30 yards, past the point where I could touch the bottom. This was where the sandy shelf gave way to deeper green. The water was extraordinary once the shock wore off, all silky and mineral clean. I floated on my back and looked at the sky. Then I rolled over and looked down. The green below me was darkening, graduating through shades I could follow with my eyes until it reached a depth where the color simply ended and there was only darkness. The lake bottom was gone or unseeable. Below my kicking feet, I couldn't even tell how far the bottom truly was. And for a second, I felt it. An almost gravitational pull. The same lurch you might get at the edge of a cliff, except inverted, dragging downward. My stomach dropped. I kicked hard toward the shallows, and that feeling broke. By the time I reached the dock, I was breathing hard and laughing at myself. "How is it?" Ethan asked. "Freezing, but amazing. Get in." "Absolutely not." "You bought a house on a lake and you refuse to swim in it?" "I bought a house with a porch. The lake is your department." Well, he did get in eventually, later that week, and he yelped loud enough that Poppy bolted from the window, hiding under the bathroom sink for about half an hour. We swam together most evenings after that, at least for a while. The water warmed up degree by degree until by midsummer it felt like nothing against your skin. The line between human body and lake dissolved. There was a night in late July that I keep coming back to. We'd eaten dinner on the porch, some pasta with whatever vegetables I'd managed to keep alive in the garden, which by that point was mostly zucchini, and we'd gone through most of a bottle of wine. The sun had been down for an hour. The sky was that deep late summer blue that refuses to go fully dark. Ethan wanted to go sit on the dock, and even though I told him I had just gotten comfortable, he pulled me up by both hands, and I complained the entire way until we were sitting at the end of the dock with our feet in the water. Ethan brought the wine bottle. The lake was warm and still. The far shore was a dark line of trees, and the other houses around the lake had their porch lights on, small, gold, and distant. It felt, at that moment, like we were the only real people in the world. The lights were just set dressing. We should have done this years ago, Ethan said. He meant the move, the lake, the house. We couldn't afford it years ago. We can barely afford it now, good deal that it was. And yet, I gestured at the lake. He clinked the bottle against my glass. Behind us on the dock, a small, determined shape was picking its way towards us, with the exaggerated caution of a creature who found the outdoors personally offensive. It was Poppy. She almost never came outside. She regarded anything beyond the front door as a vast hostile conspiracy. But that night, she walked the full length of the dock, sat down directly behind me, and pressed her face into the back of my neck. Hard. The full skull headbutt that was her way of saying, "I've arrived, and you should now be grateful." I reached back and scratched under her chin. She started to purr, an absurdly loud purr that I felt rattling my collarbone. "She's jealous," Ethan said. "She's supervising," I replied. Poppy settled against my lower back, a warm, vibrating weight, and the three of us sat there at the end of the dock while the sky finished its slow fade to eventual blackness. Then the stars came out in their full glory, and the wine ran low. Ethan talked about a fishing spot one of his coworkers had mentioned. I listened partially. I felt something brush my foot under the water. A fish, probably, or a weed stirred by the current. So I pulled my feet up for a second, then put them back down and forgot about it. That was probably our happiest moment there, and I wish it had lasted. One morning late in the summer, I woke up, and I saw that the sliding glass door to the back porch was open. Just 6 inches, though. Maybe enough to let in the morning air, make the sound of the lake a little bit more clear. But there was a smell on the air, too. Something different. Ethan was already up, making some coffee, so I asked if he had opened it. He said no, and I reiterated that it was open. He said I'd probably forgotten to latch it before bed, and the wind had pushed it further open. I accepted this. The latch on that door was finicky. You had to lift and push it to get it to catch, and if you didn't do it firmly enough, it would drift open on its own. I told myself that's what happened. But I was pretty sure I remembered latching it. I recalled the sound of it clicking and the resistance and the door settling into the frame. I mean, I latched that door every night. It was a nightly ritual by then, and that door in particular was one that I focused on. But at the time, to be honest, I wasn't sure why that door demanded more of my attention. Anyway, I let it go, and I went on with my summer. Our summer. That peculiar smell became more noticeable at the start of fall. It was like this lake water smell, but concentrated and organic. Silty, low tide, like water that has rotting things in it, with a sweetness underneath that was closer to long fermented decay. Not at all pleasant. It was faint at the start. Just a whiff in the kitchen in the morning, gone before I could be sure I'd smelled it. Then stronger just a few days later, hanging in the hallway just outside the bedroom, like a pocket of bad air just wafted in. And it would get stronger still, settling into the back of the house near the sliding glass door, and no amount of cleaning could seemingly touch it. I went through the house with vinegar and baking soda, even bleach. At one point I tried this enzymatic cleaner. Sometimes the smell would retreat for a few hours, but it would come back, as if something was making it seep through our floors. Ethan smelled it sometimes too. He said something that sounded like nothing at first, but I actually looked it up, and it's a real thing. He called it the lake turning over, fall turnover, a phenomenon where the temperature change causes the deep water to rise and the surface water to sink, and the stuff at the bottom, all that decomposition and organic material, just comes up and releases gas. It happens, it produces this sulfurous, rotten smell that can carry inland. I wanted to believe that this is what it was, and for some time I did. But that turnover smell should have been outside, coming off the water. But this smell was coming inside. It was strongest at that glass door in the hallway, in the back rooms of the house. It was like something had tracked it in and left it there. Some mornings it was strong enough that Poppy wouldn't eat her breakfast in the kitchen. She would take one step in, freeze up, then back out. Poppy. Well, I need to talk to you about Poppy. She was acting strange in those weeks, and I think it was the first thing that really scared me. Sometime mid-September, Poppy stopped going near the back of the house. She'd always been a creature of routine. She would go in the kitchen in the morning, sit in the window in the living room during the day, and she'd go to the bedroom at night. Her routine took her through the hallway that ran past the sliding door a dozen times a day. But she just stopped. She'd walk to a certain point in the hallway, roughly the point where you could see the glass door at the end of the corridor, and she would sit down and stare at it. There was nothing moving around, and she wasn't looking at the lake outside, but she seemed to be looking at the door itself. She'd sit there for an hour or two at a time, perfectly still except for a low growl. It sounded scared instead of angry. Noodle, meanwhile, continued to be Noodle. He slept on the couch and ate his food, and he would sprawl in the window and watch the lake with that same benign indifference that he gave to everything. But this made me deeply uncomfortable. Why was Poppy the only other living thing in the house that seemed to be aware of what I was feeling? She and I were on the same frequency, picking up this signal that Ethan and Noodle couldn't hear, and that loneliness was worse than the fear that was rising. By the end of September, I started to hear sounds. I would wake up at 2 or 3 in the morning, and I would hear footsteps on our dock. Heavy, soggy steps like someone walking on wood planks with bare feet after going for a swim. The dock was about 30 feet long, and the footsteps would traverse the entire length. Then they would stop. I'd lie in bed with my eyes open, listening to them. And every time, by the time I nudged Ethan awake and he was alert enough to listen, the sound would have stopped. He'd sigh and tell me it was the dock settling, that the wood was contracting in the cold night air. And the first 2 times he said this, I allowed myself to believe it. I mean, who wants to think that there was someone walking out of the lake and onto our dock every night? I like my sleep, thank you very much. By the 4th or 5th time, I stopped waking him up. I would instead lie in the dark and listen to the footsteps, come up the dock and stop at the shore end. Then I'd listen to the silence that followed. But it wasn't always a perfect silence. Sometimes I heard faint, almost inaudible, wet weight being dragged slowly across grass. One afternoon in mid-October, I walked out to the dock and I found a trail. It started at the waterline where the lake met the shore, and it went up the dock, across the yard, to the sliding glass door. The grass was pressed flat and slick in a wide path. This was no track or line, but a swath maybe 3 feet across. Something broad and heavy had moved from the water to our house. The grass was darkened and compressed. There was a faint sheen on it, a residue that smelled like the smell in that house. But the trail ended at our glass door. There were no return tracks. How is that possible? It would either have to have gone inside or gone somewhere I couldn't see or track. I called Ethan, who was at work at the time. I described what I saw. He was trying to calm me down, make me feel better. He said it could be a beaver or an otter, but I said it was 3 feet wide. He told me maybe a deer had bedded down and dragged itself. Now he was reaching. Why would a deer do that? The conversation ended, and neither of us had a good explanation. Things were getting creepy. I took some pictures of the trail. By the time Ethan had gotten home at 6, the grass had sprung back and the sheen had dried. But I had proof. I showed him the photos. He looked at them, and after a moment we looked at each other. Neither of us knew what to do, or how serious or unserious it was, but what we came up with was locking the sliding glass door with a dowel rod in the track. I did this every night from then on, and I would check it before bed, then check it again. I swear some nights I would check it a third time, just to help me sleep better. At night, when I lay in the dark listening to the footsteps on the dock, and the silence that soon followed, and that sometimes audible faint wet dragging sound across the grass, well, to me, that sounded like something coming out of our waters, walking to our house, and it was doing it every night, and I swear it was getting closer. That sliding glass door was the only thing between it and me. A few nights before Halloween, I saw it. I finally saw it. I woke up sometime past 2, and I was instantly filled with dread. It was accompanied by this pulling sensation, a compulsion that bypassed my brain entirely and spoke directly to my body. It told me to get up, go to the window, and look out at the lake. I've had compulsions before, like the urge to reread an email or refresh a page, but this was different. There was no fighting it. The best way I can describe it was gravity. Like my window became the low point in the room and I began to roll towards it. So I went to the window and I looked out at the water. The moon was up, 3/4 full. The water was that flat, black, textureless nothing like I described earlier, except where the moonlight hit it. And where the moonlight landed, I could see the dock extending out over the water, pale wood on black surface. And at the end of the dock, there was something that had not been there when I went to bed. It was low and crouched on all fours, sitting or standing on the last few planks of the dock, close to the water. And even from the bedroom window, maybe 60 feet away, I could tell it was large, wider than a human, and it looked heavy. It even made the dock look fragile underneath it. It was dark and wet. The moonlight caught moisture on its surface, and it was shifting, small stuttery movements. Its weight rocked from one limb to another, but it wasn't just adjusting position or breathing. It looked like it was trying to hold something in, like the edges of 3D models from the PS1 era. Something hung from the top of it, where the head would be, I think. Long and dark, dripping wet, it hung down to the planks of the dock. It looked like hair, extremely matted hair heavy with water, and it swayed slightly as the thing shifted its weight. It was facing the house. I stood at the window, looking at it, and I meant to look for just a few seconds, long enough to identify what I was seeing, or failed to do so. And then I would wake up Ethan, make him come to the window and see it there, so that for once he would see what I was seeing, and I would stop being alone in all this. That was the plan. A few seconds. When I looked at the clock, it was 2:47. When I woke up, I swear it was only a bit after 2. I'd been standing at that window for what must have been over 40 minutes. The time between looking at the dock and looking at the clock was, in my experience, about 15 seconds. I'd lost 40 minutes of time. This was not me just zoning out and getting absorbed in this strange sighting. It was like my time simply disappeared, or was taken. And when I looked back, the dock was empty. That thing was gone. Downstairs, the sliding glass door was open, and the dowel rod was still in the track. The door had been opened from the outside, lifted off the track and over the dowel, and sat back down. The night air was coming through now, and with it, that thick, rich, immediate smell. I knew that thing had come to our door from the dock. It had pressed itself against the opening and breathed into our house. I wondered, did it come inside? I quickly closed the door. I went upstairs and got into bed, and I covered my face. I didn't sleep. I laid there for so long listening for any noise, but everything remained quiet. In the morning, that smell was still strong. I didn't tell Ethan about what I'd seen. Up to now, he had not been listening to me, He had not been trusting to my experiences, so I just didn't think I should tell him. But there was a thought underneath that. If he wasn't experiencing this as much as I was, then this wasn't about him, was it? Whatever was happening here, I'm pretty sure it was aimed at me. One disturbing night, I woke up standing in the backyard in my pajamas, barefoot in the frost, facing the lake. The grass was so cold it burned, and the sky was that deep pre-dawn black, almost dawn. I was standing about halfway between the house and the shore, with my arms at my sides. No memory whatsoever of leaving my bed or walking downstairs. I was just there. I'd started to sleepwalk, and I had never once sleepwalked before in my life. I went inside, shaking so hard my teeth were clicking together. I woke up Ethan and told him. The look on his face was fear, real fear, which honestly was a relief. Maybe now he would finally take this more seriously, even if the thing he was taking seriously was my mental and physical health, rather than that lake. It happened again 8 days later. This time Ethan found me. I only know what happened because he told me afterward. He woke up at 3 a.m. in the morning and I wasn't in bed. He went downstairs and the sliding glass door was open. He went outside and there I was on the dock, standing at the very end, at the edge. My toes curled over the last plank, looking down into the water. He called my name, but I did not respond. He walked out onto the dock, grabbing my arm, and apparently I screamed. A scream he described as the worst sound he'd heard me make. Just pure disorientation and terror. I collapsed against him, sobbing and shaking. I had no idea where I was, how I'd even gotten there, or how long I'd been standing over that water in the freezing dark. He installed a chain lock on the bedroom door the next day. The idea was that I couldn't sleepwalk if the chain was engaged, at least not beyond the bedroom. We latched it together every night too, both of us double-checking it. For 1 week, I stayed in bed. But the week after, I woke up on the dock again, standing at the end, barefoot and freezing, facing the water. Upstairs, the bedroom door was closed. The chain was still latched from the inside, and the sliding glass door was open. I have no way to explain how this happened. Ethan drove me to a doctor that week. The doctor explained that sleepwalking is common in adults under stress. A new house, a new environment could trigger it. She prescribed a low dose of something to help me sleep deeper. I filled the prescription and took it, and I slept through the night for 3 nights in a row. But on the 4th night, I woke back up on the dock. After that, I stopped taking the pills. They weren't keeping me inside. If anything, they might have been keeping me from waking up sooner, keeping me from fighting my way back. Late fall, Poppy disappeared. I came downstairs that morning. She wasn't in any of her usual spots. I checked the hallway where she'd taken to sitting vigil, and my bedroom. Sometimes I would find her under the bathroom sink. It was her safe spot when she was stressed out. But she wasn't there either. I searched the whole house. Then I went out into the yard. I walked down the road in both directions, calling her name. Meanwhile, Noodle sat on the porch, watching me. It kinda looked like he pitied me. 2 days later, I found Poppy. For those of you who don't like to read about or hear about harm against animals, be warned. I was standing on the dock in daylight, looking out at the lake because by that point, the lake was where I looked whenever I was missing something. And she was there, about 15 feet out from the end of the dock, floating just below the surface. She was suspended in the clear water, floating like a leaf. She was intact. Her body was whole. Her fur drifted slightly in whatever faint current the springs produced. Her eyes were open and she looked bleached almost, like the color had been drawn out of her calico patches, washed out and faded. She looked like she'd been in the water for way longer than just 2 days. I waded in to get her. The water in late November in Wisconsin is so cold. It's incredibly painful for the first few moments, then becomes this lingering ache the longer you stay in. Every step I took deeper was a step my legs were telling me not to go any further. The water reached my thighs. I was almost to Poppy. I bent down and reached for her when something gripped my ankle. It didn't feel like a fish or weeds. This felt like a hand, a strong hand, and in the half-second before I ripped my leg free, I swear to you I felt fingers against my skin. Smooth and cold fingers with what felt like thick webbing between them, pressed up against my ankle as the hand squeezed. It only squeezed once, firmly, as if to get my attention. Then it let go, and I grabbed Poppy's body. I ran out of the water so fast. I was panting and crying, and I might have screamed a couple of times. When I made it to the shore, I collapsed holding my dead cat. I was shaking, and I looked down at my ankle. There was a mark where the hand had been, a white compression that would become a bruise, I could tell. The hand part I didn't tell to Ethan. I told him Poppy must have fallen off the dock at night and drowned. This part was something he believed, but the hand thing, he never would believe. Inside, I was starting to be so angry with him, like I couldn't tell him anything anymore, without some silly explanations that don't explain anything. I felt so trapped, and now my beloved Poppy was dead. I buried Poppy in the yard, near the tree line. She was wrapped in one of my sweatshirts. That night I lay in bed, listening of course to those dock footsteps and the dragging along the grass. I became angry and terrified when I heard that dragging sound approach the yard near her grave. I pulled the covers over my head, and I cried silently. After Poppy, things accelerated. Her death felt like a turning point in the worst possible way. Noodle took up Poppy's post in the hallway, staring at the sliding glass door with ears forward and body still. This should have been comforting, evidence now that Noodle felt something was wrong too. But it was not comforting. Noodle had never reacted that way before, and the fact that he was reacting that way now meant something had changed, and it meant that Noodle was in danger too. One night in early winter, I was lying in bed with the lights off. Noodle was asleep on the comforter beside me, and yet I heard Noodle meowing at the back door. That sound was coming from outside the sliding glass door, down the hall. It was distinctively Noodle's yowling cry, the cry of a cat that wants to be let in. Any cat owner knows what I'm talking about, and it sounded exactly like Noodle. But Noodle was on the bed right next to me. I could even feel the weight of him against my leg, and I could hear his slow, sleeping breaths. These cat calls went on for maybe 3 minutes, a cycle of meow, pause, meow, and each cry was close to right but not quite right. It was sort of warped at the tail end of each meow. Now that part was something that Noodle had never done. Something was standing outside my glass door in the dark, mimicking my cat, trying to lure me outside. The following morning I found handprints on the outside of the glass, wide and thick-fingered, with smears between the fingers where webbing had dragged across the surface. I was sure of it. They were at my exact height, placed as if to anticipate where my face would be, so I would see them, so I would find them, or perhaps evidence that the thing had peered inside. I took more pictures, and I waited for Ethan to get home. By 6 o'clock, they had dried to faint smudges that could have been anything, and in Ethan's defense, the photos were blurry. When he looked at them, he looked worried but not overly concerned. This time he didn't even say anything. That silence between us had now become a room we both lived in, but neither of us could leave. Then I started to wake up with my side of the bed damp. I initially thought it was from sweat, but this was cold, and it smelled like lake water, with that deep organic rot sweetness, and it pulled in the depression where my body lay, like someone had poured it there while I slept. Every morning I stripped the bed and washed everything, and every morning the dampness would be back, a cold patch above my pillow and along my shoulder and hip. That smell would cling to my hair and skin. I could smell it on myself throughout every day, even if I showered. I started to have dreams about that lake, and they weren't nightmares. In the dreams, the water was warm and the lake was calm. I walked in from the shore and the water rose around me, and it felt like a warm, wet hug. And it was so comforting. And I could tell in my mind in the dream that there was something waiting in the deep part of the water, down where the springs were, where the light didn't reach. Something patient, and the closer I got, the more it felt like I was going home. I would wake up from these dreams calm, and even feeling better than I had in weeks. But that calmness would soon terrify me, as I realized something was beckoning me into the water, and its calls were working. Of course, I didn't tell Ethan about the dreams. I was running out of things to even tell him. Every piece of evidence I brought to him either degraded before he could see it, or sounded in the daylight like the testimony of a woman who was falling apart. He suggested therapy. I said I didn't need it. We argued about it in the kitchen in low, exhausted voices. And the argument wasn't about therapy. It was about the fact we were now living two different realities, and neither of us could cross into the other's. And that thing in the lake, whether it knew it or not, whether it was capable of strategy or just operated on a predatory instinct, too old and too patient for me to outmaneuver, it was isolating me from the only person in the world I truly loved, the one that could have helped. I'm almost certain now that's what it was doing. It was separating me from Ethan. It was a lion separating the injured gazelle from the rest of the herd. But this thing wasn't using force or speed, but slow, steady application of pressure that made me harder and harder to believe, that made my evidence disappear, made my fear look like illness, until the distance between us was so wide, I was functionally alone, even with him sleeping next to me. It wanted me alone. It wanted me alone, and it wanted me tired, and it wanted me dreaming about warm water, and it was getting everything it wanted. Around the middle of December, I found this article. I was looking things up online, anything about the lake, like its local history or folklore or news items, anything I could find. After finding nothing useful, mainly just a couple of forum posts about lake spirits and water hauntings that read like fiction and offered no specifics, I searched instead the address of the house. After some deep digging, I found a local newspaper archive entry from 6 years earlier. A woman had walked into the lake at night and disappeared. She was the wife of the previous owner. The couple our realtor had said relocated for work. But that wasn't the case. This woman's body was never recovered. Her husband had sold the house a month later and moved to an entirely different state. The official cause was accidental drowning. The article included one quote from a neighbor, identified only as a longtime resident of the lake, who said the woman had been having trouble sleeping in the weeks before she vanished. I read through that article 3 times. Then I put my coat on and I walked around the lake to Dirth's house, and I knocked on his door. He knew why I was there. I could tell by the look on his face before I uttered a word. I think he'd been waiting for this visit, but hoped it wouldn't come. "Dirth," I said, "I need to ask you about the people who lived in our house before us." He didn't answer right away. I even watched as he looked past me to the lake. Then he stepped back from the door and said, "You'd better come in." He made coffee. I sat at his kitchen table, and he moved around the kitchen slowly. I could tell he was reluctant. He sat down across from me and set the mugs between us, and I just waited for him to speak. He wrapped both hands around his mug and stared into it. "The house has had trouble," he said finally. That's the way I'd put it. "What kind of trouble?" "The kind you're having. The Lindstroms. That was the last name of the people that were there before you. And before the Lindstroms, there was another couple. I don't recall the name. Both times, they left fast. Those who were left. And both times, it was the wife." I felt a sting behind my sternum. "What do you mean, it was the wife?" I mean, she was the one having problems. Couldn't sleep, couldn't stop watching the water. Her husband thought it was the isolation. Thought she was getting anxious out here by herself all day. The Lindstrom woman, she used to walk the yard at night. Her husband would find her standing at the shore in just her nightgown. She told him things were coming out of the lake. He had to take her to a doctor. And what of the woman before her? I don't know the specifics. I know they left in a hurry, and I know it was winter when they did. I know that the wife was not well. Dearth, the people here before us, the Lindstroms, the wife drowned. I found the article. I know she died. He closed his eyes, and when he opened them again, he was looking at the table between us, at the coffee in his hands once more. I'm not going to sit here and tell you what's in that lake, he said. I've lived here my whole life, and I don't know. I'm not going to speculate, because speculation is how you start sounding mad. And sounding mad is exactly how every one of those women got dismissed. The kitchen was quiet after that. The clock was ticking on the wall. Through his window I could see the lake, flat and dark in the late afternoon, but not as dark as it could get. You need to leave that house, he said, and I could tell he didn't want to say it. I'm sorry. I should have said something when you moved in. Someone should have said something to you before you even bought the place. But I talked myself out of saying anything when we first met. I thought maybe this time could be different. He shook his head once. It's not different. It's never different. You need to leave. It was the first time in months another human being had confirmed what I was experiencing. I almost broke apart right there in his kitchen. But I managed to hold it together, and I thanked him. I then walked home around the lake in the late afternoon light, and I forced myself not to look at the water. That night I sat Ethan down and I told him all of it. The hand in the water that grabbed me, the wet sheets, the fake cat sounds, handprints, dreams, and the article about the woman who walked into that lake and was never found. I told him I thought the thing in the lake had done this before, and that it chose the woman in the house, and that now it was choosing me. I said if we didn't leave, it was going to get me the way it got her. I said all of this standing in our kitchen with the lights on and the sliding glass door locked. I watched his face while I said it, and for the first time, he didn't push back on me. Something got through. Maybe the accumulation of everything, but it got through. He said okay, we could leave. He began to pack boxes with me that night. We planned to leave on a Saturday morning. Ethan took a personal day on Friday to pack, and by that evening, the house was half in boxes. The kitchen was mostly done. The living room had been stripped of anything that wasn't furniture. Our bedroom was now just a mattress and some overnight bags. Noodle was already in his carrier by the front door, which I had set up that afternoon because I wanted him to be safe. I wanted at least one living thing in this house to be ready to leave at a moment's notice. Noodle sat in his carrier and watched us through the mesh with his wide orange face, and for once he wasn't staring at the hallway or the glass door. He was watching us, and I chose to interpret that as agreement. I should have insisted that we leave that night. I knew this at the time, and I know it now. My very soul was telling me to go now, go in the dark, get in the car and drive. But Ethan was exhausted, and the car was not fully loaded, and it seemed irrational to flee at 10 o'clock at night when we were leaving at just 7 in the morning. So I did what I'd been doing for months. I rationalized, telling myself 9 hours didn't matter, that the dowel was in the track and the chain was on the bedroom door and Ethan was with me and it would be fine. Just one more night. We went to bed at 11. I lay there on our stripped mattress with a single blanket, listening to the house. And for a change, there were no footsteps on the dock or dragging in the grass. The house was so quiet. It hadn't been that way in months. Ethan fell asleep quickly. I didn't. I lay there and watched the ceiling and waited for the sound that would surely come. I'd been conditioned to it. But I fell asleep at some point. I must have. Because the next thing I experienced was not a continuation of lying in bed, but a sharp, gasping return to consciousness. And I was not in my bed. I was in the lake. I was standing waist deep in black water in the dark, and the cold was so total and immediate that my body had not yet processed it. I was past shivering, past gasping for air, in some sort of suspended state where my nervous system was still compiling the information and had not yet delivered the full report. My feet were on the lake bottom, the silty, soft bottom that I remembered from summer, from swimming, back when this water was something I loved and I could feel the ground sloping away in front of me. The shelf, the drop-off where the shallows ended and the deep part began, where 80 or 90 feet of black water sat above springs that never stopped flowing, a bottom that no one had ever actually seen. I was standing at the edge of it. One more step, and the ground would fall away, and the water would take me. I must have sleepwalked again. I had no memory of getting out of bed or coming out here. I'd walked out while unconscious, exactly where it wanted me. The smell was everywhere, fully concentrated all around me, rising from the water, so thick I could taste it on my tongue. The lake at night was the flattest, blackest thing I'd ever seen. No reflection at all, not even moonlight. Just abyssal water in every direction, and the shore behind me. But now it seemed so impossibly far away. My house beyond it with the lights off and the doors open. I then felt it below me. Not touching me, but there in the water around my legs. A current of movement. Something was circling beneath the surface, just below me, moving slow. I could feel the water shifting against my skin as it passed. I looked down. I wish I hadn't. In the faint ambient light, I could see a shape under the surface. Broad, dark, and low, orbiting me. I saw hair fanning out behind it, or from it. Long dark hair spreading in the water like weeds. I saw a hand, too. It drifted up from the shape of it, and it came to rest against my thigh. It didn't grip, but it held on, like it had been waiting for a friend who had finally arrived. I heard Ethan screaming my name from the shore. His voice was so distant and raw. He must have woken up in bed, realizing I was gone, only to find his wife standing in a freezing lake in the dark. The exact situation of the former residence. I knew he was coming for me, to rescue me, but my legs would not respond to my will. The hand on my thigh was gentle and the water around me was cold, but that cold was fading. Or was I fading? Somewhere beneath my terror was that feeling from my dreams. That warmth, the all-encompassing comfort and relief. Something was telling me not to fight, to just let go, and the water would take me somewhere that wasn't here, but was better, and all my exhaustion, fear, and loneliness would finally end. The bottom shifted under me. The silt gave way to nothing. I was at the shelf. One more step and the hand tightened. That thing rose toward me. I felt the water surge as it came up from below. And for a split second, it was directly in front of me, face to face, and I could feel its breath in the water against my chest. A rhythmic pulse of displaced water from something that was breathing underwater, or simulating it at least. Its other hand came up and touched my arm. I watched as its mouth opened. I felt this part more than I saw it. A widening in the dark shape, inches from my face. But it kept going past where a mouth should stop. It made a sound then, a sound that did not come from it, not even from above the water. It was in the water. It traveled through the lake and into my body. I felt it in my spine and teeth, a low vibration, and I immediately knew what it meant. Come with me. Suddenly, Ethan had me. He was in the water waist deep, his hands were under my arms, and he was hauling me backward, and that thing let go. Ethan did not overpower it. Ethan is 170 pounds, an IT guy who goes to the gym twice a week. He had not wrestled me free from something that lives in 80 feet of black water. It released me. It let me go, just like it had chosen to let go of my ankle when I got Poppy. It let me go because it decided to, and the decision was not about Ethan, and it wasn't about force. I'm only alive now because I was allowed to leave. Whatever it is, it didn't want to take me by force. It takes only if you choose to go. Ethan dragged me to the shore. I was coughing and gasping, and I was so freezing cold, my muscles had stopped working properly. My legs buckled when I hit the bank. He pulled me up onto the grass and I collapsed, and so did he, next to me. We lay there on the frozen ground in the dark, soaked from the waist down. I could hear his rapid breathing, and I heard the lake behind us, still black and so very silent. Nothing followed us out. Ethan and I did not go back inside the house. He carried me to our car, placing me carefully in the passenger seat. He then wrapped me in the emergency blanket from the trunk. He went back for Noodle in her carrier by the front door, and that was it. That was all we took. He started the car, and we drove away from that house at 1:30 in the morning. The heater was on full blast, and the windows were up. The two of us live in Madison now. We're in a third-floor apartment. There are no lakes or ponds nearby. We're surrounded on all sides by concrete, asphalt, and other people. I should feel safe, right? During the day, mostly, I do. We never did go back for our things. Ethan arranged with a moving company to empty the house and put everything in storage. I told him I didn't want any of it, and he had no arguments or debates about that. The house went on the market in February. I've got no idea what the realtor told the new buyers about why we left. I imagine she said we relocated for work. Ethan and I are okay, but I choose that word carefully. We're functional, and we're together, and we're trying. The space between us that lake had created is still there, but it's smaller now. Some nights he reaches for me in the dark, and I let him hold me, and we don't talk about what happened. That's the good silence, different from what we had at the lake, and I can live with that. But I still dream about the water, even though it's less frequent. At most, once a week. In those dreams, the lake is warm and the water is calm. I walk in and something is still waiting for me in the deep part, patient as it's always been, and I can feel that enticing comfort beckoning me. I wake from those dreams calm and rested, and that still disturbs me. I've started to wonder whether the calm will always terrify me, or whether there will come a point when I finally get over it. Noodle is fine and alive. He's developed a new behavior that I have not mentioned to Ethan yet, though. He seems to stare at the drains in the house. He sits at the edge of the bathtub and watches the drain for a good 10 minutes at a time. His ears will be forward and his body still, and he's so intensely focused. It reminds me of Poppy when she would stare at the sliding glass door. He does the same thing at the kitchen sink, sitting there on the counter staring down into the drain, not moving for some time. I watch him watching it, and I tell myself it's just a cat being a cat. Cats fixate on small dark holes and creepy dark corners. They're wired to watch for prey. But then I remember I had told myself that sliding glass door would stay locked, and I was wrong then. One more thing. One night not too long ago, I woke up, and my feet were wet. I live on the 3rd floor, as I said before. There's no lake. My feet were wet and the sheets at the bottom of the bed were damp. When I sat up and looked at the floor, there were footprints on the hard wood, leading from the front door to my side of the bed and back to the door. I haven't told Ethan, and I pray it's all in my head. I lock and deadbolt the door every night. And I always lie down in bed before going to sleep, just listening for so very long. I pray it lets go of me. I just don't know how long that's gonna be. Well, that was an emotional roller coaster. Rip Poppy, and rip Ethan's marriage. This just goes to show you, if a loved one reports some boogeyman activity, you'd better listen if you enjoy your cozy life, or it may turn into a nightmare you can't wake up from. Good night. Thank you for joining me on this episode of Unexplained Encounters. I've been your host, Darkness Prevails. You can find Unexplained Encounters episodes on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, your favorite podcast apps, or on YouTube on the Darkness Prevails channel. Send me your stories at darkstories.org. And don't forget to like, follow, and share if you want to scare your friends. Till next time, everyone, stay safe out there and stay creepy, because this world is a strange one.